close your eyes, and let's drift back to a time of secrets and shadows. Relax your mind as we explore 50 American conspiracies together that turned out to be true. Let me read you a forgotten tale of mind control and memory erased. You find yourself in a government facility that technically doesn't exist. The walls are painted a sterile white, the clock ticks too loudly, and the lights buzz with that annoying fluorescent hum. A man in a suit asks you to sit. You don't know why you're here. You're offered a drink. It's laced. You sip. And soon, reality melts like a crayon on a hot dashboard. This isn't a sci-fi movie. It's MK Ultra, the CIA's real-life project to control minds. For years, the public thought it was just Cold War paranoia. Brainwashing, hypnosis, LSD experiments, please. And then, decades later, declassified documents spilled out like ink from a broken pen. Turns out, the CIA really was running a program to break and rebuild the human mind. They called it research. Their test subjects, prisoners, mental patients, unsuspecting citizens, even fellow agents. You're strapped to a gurney. The doctor smiles gently. You won't remember this, he whispers. Then the injection. The program began in the 1950s, led by a Canadian psychiatrist with an unfortunate passion for electroshock therapy. The CIA wanted to see if they could erase memories, reprogram beliefs, and even create sleeper agents, like little human time bombs. They used LSD, sensory deprivation, forced drug addiction, and sleep deprivation. Sometimes all at once. One mainstream fact: President Gerald Ford's 1975 commission publicly confirmed MK Ultra's existence. The head of the CIA at the time, Richard Helms, destroyed many records, but a few rogue boxes survived. What they contained was enough to curl your toes. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some sessions took place in a safe house nicknamed the Playboy Pad, where agents dosed Johns with LSD to study their behavior. Imagine being drugged while you're just trying to have a good time, only to end up in someone's field notes. Scientists still argue whether MK Ultra was about control, chaos, or just unfiltered experimentation. Some claim it succeeded. Others believe it was an expensive hallucination with a tragic body count. Now, picture this. You walk into a clinic for insomnia. They hand you a pill. You take it. You sleep. But when you wake up, something is missing. Maybe a memory. Maybe your favorite color. Or maybe, just maybe, you're suddenly very patriotic. Sleep tight. You blink. You're not in the lab anymore. You're in a speakeasy, deep underground. Jazz hums through the air. Smoke curls like a ghost from the bartender's cigar. And you raise your glass of gin. It's illegal, of course. But hey, so is breathing too loudly in this joint. Prohibition's in full swing. And the feds, they're not just cracking down. They're lacing the booze. Yes, seriously. During the 1920s and early 30s, while America was dry in theory, the thirst never stopped. People kept drinking, and bootleggers kept brewing. So the government, ever so clever, took a dark turn. They ordered industrial alcohol to be poisoned. Not just once, again and again. Methanol, formaldehyde, kerosene, the kind of stuff that makes your liver file for early retirement. They called it a deterrent. The thinking went, if we make drinking dangerous enough, people will stop. Spoiler, they didn't, and the body count climbed. By the end of Prohibition, estimates suggest over 10,000 people had died from poisoned alcohol. Casualties in a war nobody voted for. You sip your drink again, but this time it burns more than expected. Your head spins, not from the booze, but from the idea that your own government might have done this to you, on purpose. One mainstream fact: this policy was confirmed in 1926 by the New York medical examiner, who publicly stated the government knew it was deadly and continued anyway. Chilling words to read on an empty stomach, or a full martini. Here's your quirky tidbit. Bootleggers fought back by hiring renegade chemists, actual reverse poisoners, whose whole job was to unpoison the poisoned alcohol. Imagine telling your parents you're dropping out of med school to be a gin fixer. Scientists still argue whether this tactic was truly a direct government murder campaign or just criminal negligence served cold. Either way, you're still dead at the end. And while you're reeling from that thought, here's a fun little modern twist. The phrase bathtub gin, not just a metaphor. People literally brewed it in bathtubs. Sanitation standards were somewhere between medieval and college dorm. So next time you raise a glass, think of the flappers, gangsters, and jazz musicians who partied through poison. And of course, the bureaucrats who made it all possible with one ink-stained memo. You lean back in your wooden chair, dizzy from the truth. The lights flicker low, the clarinet plays on, and the gin, well, it's not feeling quite so glamorous now. You're on a naval ship now. It's now 1964, and the South China Sea is boiling with tension. The sun glares down, salt clings to your skin, and someone yells about incoming torpedoes. You scramble, adrenaline kicking in. But the strange thing is, no one's really sure if anything was fired. Welcome to the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Or more accurately, the Gulf of Tonkin ? This moment is often cited as the spark that ignited full-scale US involvement in Vietnam. A reported attack on American destroyers by North Vietnamese forces triggered Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It handed President Johnson a blank check for war. Only later did people start asking, wait, what actually happened out there? You peer through binoculars. The sea is quiet. Too quiet. Radar pings echo, sonar reports bounce, but the enemy? Nowhere to be seen. Here's the punchline. The second attack, the one used to justify military escalation, probably didn't happen at all. Even one of the ship's commanders, Captain John Herrick, sent a message back saying, "Review of action makes many recorded contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports." Translation: might have just been fish, or lightning, or paranoia in uniform. One mainstream fact: in 2005, declassified NSA documents confirmed that intelligence was skewed to make the incident appear more threatening than it really was. Some officials knew the truth at the time and kept quiet. Your quirky tidbit: the Pentagon actually published a comic book shortly afterward to drum up public support for the war. Propaganda, but make it pulp fiction. Scientists still argue whether the first attack actually happened at all, or if it, too, was a warped misreading of the chaos. But there's less and less debate that the second attack was essentially a ghost battle, sound and fury signifying nothing. And yet, it led to real consequences. Thousands of lives lost, years of bloody conflict, napalm, draft cards, helicopters slicing through jungle fog, all built on sonar blips and political spin. You stand at the rail, staring out at the waves, trying to spot the shape of a lie on the horizon. Nothing comes, just more water, and somewhere behind you, in a command room filled with coffee cups and static, a man nods. That's enough to go to war. You probably won't survive this one either. But hey, it makes for a heck of a bedtime story. You're sitting in a folding chair in rural Alabama. It's the early 1930s. The sun is merciless, and you're told the doctors are here to help. You nod, relieved. The nurse smiles politely. They're from the government, they say. This is the start of the study. You'll get checkups, meals, maybe even a burial. What they don't say? That you have syphilis. And they're not going to treat it. Welcome to the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Afro male, one of the most infamous medical experiments in American history. The study began in 1932 and ran for 40 years. The goal, according to official documents, was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis. The test subjects were poor black men, sharecroppers, laborers, and veterans, recruited with promises of free healthcare. But there was no treatment. Even after penicillin became widely available in the 1940s, these men were denied it, on purpose. You show up for your appointment, expecting kindness. Instead, you get blood drawn and vague reassurances. You're sick, but no one tells you why. You're contagious, but no one warns your family. You get worse. Still, the clipboard clicks. The study continues. One mainstream fact. In 1972, a whistleblower finally leaked the story to the press. Outrage erupted, and the program was shut down within months. Congressional hearings followed. The damage, however, was already done. More than 100 men died. Dozens of wives were infected, and children were born with congenital syphilis. Your quirky tidbit? Participants were given treatment in the form of spinal taps, painful, unnecessary procedures disguised as medical care. Imagine being lied to with a needle in your back. Scientists still argue whether the study was a product of racism, scientific arrogance, bureaucratic indifference, or all three. Some say the researchers believed they were doing something noble. Others think they simply saw these men as disposable data points. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology to the surviving families. But no amount of "we're sorry" can quite undo the betrayal of trust at that scale. It's not just a stain on medical ethics. It's a billboard-sized red flag flapping in the wind of American history. You walk away from the clinic, stomach tight, unsure what's worse, the sickness you carry, or the people who smiled as they watched it fester. Sleep might come slow after this one. But remember, truth, even when delayed, eventually cracks the surface. You're adjusting your tie. The wire is scratchy against your chest. You clear your throat. Across the room, a preacher stands at the pulpit. He doesn't know the FBI is listening, recording, filing, analyzing every word, every pause. His name is Martin Luther King Jr. And they're building a case not to arrest him, but to crush him. In the 1960s, under the direction of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau launched a full-scale surveillance operation against civil rights leaders. Dr. King, in particular, was targeted with a mixture of wiretaps, smear campaigns, forged letters, and deeply personal harassment. The goal? Discredit him, disgrace him, silence him. You flip through transcripts. Most are ordinary. Sermons, phone calls with colleagues. But the Bureau isn't looking for crimes. They're hunting for shame, for secrets, for anything that could make the public turn its back on the man dreaming of justice. One mainstream fact: the FBI's surveillance of MLK was real, extensive, and officially admitted in declassified documents. They even sent him an anonymous letter, now known as the suicide letter, implying he should take his own life or be publicly exposed. The letter is chilling. Phrases like, "Your end is approaching and you are finished," weren't subtle. The kicker? It was sent just before he received the Nobel Peace Prize. Your quirky tidbit. Hoover, obsessed with control, allegedly had a 17,000-page file on King. That's longer than the Harry Potter series. Twice. The FBI wasn't just watching. They were archiving his existence. Scientists still argue whether this surveillance was solely about national security, or if it was also deeply personal, an effort by Hoover to maintain his grip on American power structures. Spoiler, it was probably both. You're sitting in a back room now, reel-to-reel tape spinning. You feel complicit. The recordings aren't what you expected. They're human. Private. Not scandalous. Just intimate. But the Bureau doesn't care. They're preparing an entire PR package to leak to the press. Not to protect the country, but to neutralize a dream. Imagine being followed not by enemies, but by the people sworn to protect your rights. Years later, MLK's legacy towers over those grainy tapes. The FBI's efforts failed in the long run, but not without leaving scars, and not without reminding us how easily the instruments of justice can be pointed the wrong way. You sit still. The tape crackles into silence. Somewhere, the letter sits in a glass case. Proof that even peace can threaten power. You're back in a dusty filing room. The air smells like carbon paper and cold coffee. A man in a grey suit wheels in a cart stacked with boxes. Each one is stamped with the same word, COINTELPRO. You don't know what it means yet, but you will. And once you do, you'll start to wonder how many groups got silenced before they even got a chance to speak. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was the FBI's secret weapon in the war against, well, anyone they found inconvenient. Launched in 1956 and kept hidden for years, it was designed to infiltrate, disrupt, and dismantle domestic political groups deemed subversive. Sounds fair enough, until you see the list. Civil rights organizations, anti-war protesters, women's liberation movements, Puerto Rican independence activists, even environmentalists. You sit in on a meeting of peace activists. The door creaks. Someone joins late. They smile too much. They take too many notes. They might be a snitch. Or worse, a government plant whose job is to stir conflict and destroy the group from within. One mainstream fact. The existence of COINTELPRO was officially confirmed by the Church Committee in the 1970s, after activists literally broke into an FBI field office in 1971 and stole documents that blew the lid off the whole thing. That's right. This conspiracy was exposed by a heist. Your quirky tidbit. One of the FBI's actual goals in a memo was to prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify the black nationalist movement. That's not a movie plot. That's a line from a real internal document. Scientists still argue whether COINTELPRO was a temporary overreach or a symptom of something deeper in the American surveillance state. Was it an aberration? Or just the tip of a very paranoid iceberg? You start to notice the patterns. Anonymous letters designed to cause mistrust between leaders. False news articles planted in local papers. Rumors of affairs. Whisper campaigns. Informants sent to escalate protests into riots so they could be labeled dangerous. All part of a playbook designed to erode movements from the inside out. And it worked. Some groups collapsed from infighting. Others were discredited publicly. Many leaders were surveilled, harassed, arrested, or worse, all under the banner of national security, which seems to mean something different depending on who's holding the pen. You flip through another file. It's handwritten. A memo about infiltrating a student meeting. You pause. The names are familiar. They're people who gave speeches, wrote essays, marched peacefully. People who believed in change. And the system's response? Bugs in their phones and bugs in their apartments. You lean back, suddenly aware of how quiet the room has become. Almost too quiet. It's enough to make you check your phone, just in case. You light up a cigarette. It's the 1990s, and you're in a boardroom with oak-paneled walls and men in tailored suits. They're all smiles. Behind them, charts show upward arrows, a booming market, and glowing forecasts. You cough. One of them nods at your cigarette. Completely safe, he says. We'd know. But they did know. For decades. Welcome to Big Tobacco's long, slow-motion lie. A conspiracy so profitable it burned across generations. For years, cigarette companies swore that smoking wasn't addictive and didn't cause cancer. They paid scientists to say so. They funded front groups. They even ran ad campaigns with doctors smiling over packs of Lucky Strikes. You blow smoke toward the ceiling. It curls like a question mark. But behind the smoke, the truth was rotting away, hidden in internal memos and classified research. One mainstream fact: in 1994, 7 CEOs of America's largest tobacco companies testified before Congress, each declaring under oath that they did not believe nicotine was addictive. Spoiler, they were lying. Less than 3 years later, internal documents were leaked showing they had known since the 1960s that nicotine was not just addictive, but engineered to be addictive. Your quirky tidbit: tobacco companies experimented with ammonia to create something called freebasing nicotine, a process that made it hit your brain faster, harder, and more addictively. Think of it as the crack cocaine version of smoking. Scientists still argue whether these executives believed they were just protecting their business or if they were genuinely convinced they'd gotten away with it. The answer, as always, probably depends on which yacht they were relaxing on at the time. The web ran deep. Public relations firms crafting doubt, research institutions quietly funded by tobacco money, politicians paid to stall regulations. Even cartoons weren't safe. Remember Joe Camel? Designed to appeal to kids as young as 8. That's not an accusation. That's data from their own marketing research. Eventually, the lawsuits came. The whistleblowers stepped forward. A massive $206 billion settlement followed, the largest in US history at the time. But it was too late for millions. The health damage? Irreversible. The deaths? Counted in the tens of millions worldwide. And even then, many of the companies never really apologized. They just added more disclaimers, swapped logos, and started selling in countries with looser laws. You take another puff. It tastes like cherry lies and vanilla regret. And now you know why that mild label never really meant mild, and why the filter didn't save your uncle. The truth, it was always there, buried in a filing cabinet behind a locked door, behind another locked door, guarded by silence and suits. You exhale. The smoke clears. The conspiracy stays. You're in a Pentagon office now, circa 1962. The walls are lined with maps of Cuba, red pins stabbed into the coastlines like warnings. A general leans over a file folder marked Top Secret. You expect invasion plans, maybe surveillance photos. Instead, the documents lay out something weirder and darker. It's a list of fake terrorist attacks the US military proposed staging against American citizens to justify going to war with Cuba. This was Operation Northwoods, a declassified plan from the highest levels of the Department of Defense. The idea? Conduct or simulate acts of terror on US soil, blame them on Fidel Castro, and gin up public support for an invasion. We're talking fake plane hijackings, false flag bombings, even staging a mourning campaign for fake casualties. You raise your eyebrows, flipping pages. One memo suggests sinking a boat of Cuban refugees and blaming it on Havana. Another recommends hijacking a drone-painted commercial airliner, crashing it remotely, and saying Americans were killed. All make-believe, except for the part where people might really get hurt. One mainstream fact: these documents were released in the 1990s by the JFK Assassination Records Review Board, and they are 100% real. The proposals were drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and signed by Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer. Your quirky tidbit: one proposed operation involved simulating a Cuban missile attack on a neighboring Caribbean country using weather balloons and firecrackers. Yes, firecrackers. Apparently, even war plans can have a Looney Tunes moment. Scientists still argue whether Operation Northwoods was ever seriously considered, or if it was simply military brainstorming gone off the rails. President Kennedy rejected the plan outright, and soon after, Lemnitzer was reassigned to NATO. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. What's unsettling isn't just that the plan existed, it's that it was so calmly written. The language is cold, clean, surgical. Casualties would be helpful in increasing credibility, one-line notes, as if lives were bullet points on a PowerPoint slide. You imagine the room quieting after the proposal was read aloud. No one screaming, no one flipping tables, just nods, adjusted glasses. A few "we'll workshop that's." The real terror, you realize, wasn't just what could have happened, but how close we came to making it real. It's the kind of thing you'd expect in a dystopian novel, not a real US military file stamped with stars and stripes. And so, you sit back in your chair, haunted not by what the enemy might do, but by what your own team was willing to fake. The lights flicker. Somewhere outside, a jet rumbles overhead. You wonder, briefly, if anyone would ever know, if it were all just part of the plan. You're in a dim room with a red phone ringing. The president answers. On the other end, a scandal, wrapped in a secret, buried in deniability. It's the 1980s, and the Cold War's still on, at least officially. But behind closed doors, something strange is happening. Weapons are being sold to Iran, yes, that Iran, while the profits are funneled to anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua, illegally. Welcome to the Iran-Contra affair, where the rules were more like suggestions. It starts simple, as these things do. The US wants to free hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran, an enemy on paper, has influence there. So the idea is pitched: sell them weapons in secret. In exchange, they help release the hostages. Totally illegal under US law and arms embargoes, by the way. But hey, what's a little light treason between former allies? Then it gets even more creative. The cash from those weapon sales, it gets laundered and sent to the Contras, a rebel group fighting the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Congress had explicitly banned funding for them under the Boland Amendment. So naturally, someone said, let's do it anyway. One mainstream fact: the whole thing unraveled in 1986 when a plane carrying weapons for the Contras was shot down, and the surviving crew member sang like a parrot with a megaphone. That sparked investigations, hearings, and one of the most surreal moments in modern politics. Your quirky tidbit? At one point, the White House literally sold spare parts for missiles to Iran in exchange for political favors and called it a neat idea. That's an actual quote from National Security Council staffer Oliver North, who helped run the entire scheme from his office. He even shredded documents in the middle of the investigation. Classic move. Scientists still argue whether the affair was a rogue operation or sanctioned at the highest levels. President Reagan denied knowledge, then admitted it, then kind of walked it back with the facts are fuzzy shrug. By the end, over a dozen officials were indicted, but most convictions were overturned or pardoned. You watch a televised hearing. Oliver North wears his uniform like armor. He testifies with crisp confidence. The nation watches, stunned. Some see a patriot, others see a villain. Everyone sees a guy who definitely knew where the bodies, metaphorically, were buried. The scandal blended covert operations, ideological battles, and enough shredded paper to stuff 1,000 piñatas. And it made Americans ask a queasy question. If laws can be bent this far in the shadows, who's really steering the ship? The phone clicks. The red light fades. Somewhere, paperwork still burns quietly in a shredder's belly. And you're just trying to fall asleep, knowing the line between hero and criminal might be written in invisible ink. You're in a cold, echoing room filled with silence and secrets. Metal tables, low lighting, the soft clink of surgical tools. But this isn't a morgue. It's a government lab. The kind that doesn't have a nameplate on the door. And the subjects on those tables, they're children. Specifically, dead infants. Without their parents' permission, their body parts were harvested for research. Welcome to Project Sunshine, possibly the most misleadingly cheerful code name in American history. It sounds like a bad dream. In the 1950s and 60s, during the height of nuclear testing, US scientists were desperate to learn how radioactive fallout affected human tissue, especially the growing tissue of children. The problem was, they needed samples, real samples, so they took them, without consent, from funeral homes, from hospitals, even from foreign countries. You run your finger down a document. The language is clinical. Bone material required. Tissue yield acceptable. They weren't studying the living. They were dissecting the already gone. Hundreds of infants, many from grieving families who had no idea what had been taken from their babies' remains. One mainstream fact, declassified documents and a 1955 Atomic Energy Commission memo confirmed that Project Sunshine used over 1,500 samples, many of them collected unethically from cadavers around the world. The purpose was to measure the absorption of strontium-90, a radioactive isotope from nuclear tests. Your quirky tidbit. One official, when asked why they didn't just ask for permission, replied something like, "If we told the mothers what we were doing, they'd never agree." That's not science. That's something out of a Bond villain's HR manual. Scientists still argue whether the research could have been conducted ethically and still yielded the same results. Some say the urgency of Cold War fears justified the means. Others argue there's never a moral grey area when you're sawing open caskets without consent. You close the folder. It feels heavier than it should, like it's soaked in something you can't quite name. Grief, maybe, or betrayal, or just the weight of people being turned into data points. And the name, Sunshine, stings a little, as if branding could bleach away the darkness. You walk out of the lab, heart knotted, wondering how many families were told their baby passed peacefully, while scientists in the next building were harvesting their ribs. You probably won't hear this story in school, But it happened, and for a long time, no one talked about it, until the files leaked, until a few curious minds couldn't let it go. The door clicks shut behind you. The silence returns. But now, at least, it has a voice. You're strapped into the back seat of a fighter jet, helmet on, eyes wide. Below you, the ocean glitters. Ahead of you, something glows. Not a plane, not a bird, definitely not a weather balloon. It moves like it's thinking, intelligently, deliberately. You glance at the pilot. His jaw is clenched. "You seeing this?" he asks. You nod. And for the first time in decades, the US government does too. This is the Pentagon's official release of unidentified aerial phenomena, or as you and every third YouTuber still call them, UFOs. For years, sightings were dismissed. If you talked about them, you were labeled a crank, a nutjob, a guy who spent too much time in his cousin's garage with ham radios and foil hats. But in 2020 and 2021, the US government finally confirmed what many had whispered about for decades. They had video, real video, from military-grade sensors, tracked by pilots and radar operators, and they had no idea what the things were. One mainstream fact: the Pentagon publicly confirmed 3 Navy videos: VLA-R-1, Go Fast, and Gimbal, all showing flying objects that moved in ways no known human technology can. Instant accelerations, stops, turns without inertia, no wings, no heat signature. Your quirky tidbit? One pilot described the object as looking like a tic-tac, smooth, oblong white, and moving in a way that defied physics. Another pilot joked, "It's got no rotors, no exhaust, and it just outran my FA-18. Scientists still argue whether these phenomena are evidence of advanced foreign tech, natural atmospheric anomalies, or something a little more off-world. But what no one's arguing anymore is whether the encounters are real. They are. They've been seen by trained observers, recorded by the best equipment available, and even analyzed by a Pentagon task force. You lean forward, staring into the grayscale blur on the radar. The object darts sideways, without banking, without slowing down. You're not sure if it's flying or just being somewhere. That's how weird this is. And for once, the conspiracy isn't that the government knows and is hiding it. It's that the government doesn't know either. The classified briefings even say it: unknown origin, which is polite government speak for "we're kind of freaking out too." Imagine that. After decades of cover-ups, you finally get honesty. And the honesty is, we've got no clue. You float there in the jet, silent, as the object zips away. Faster than your eyes can track, you blink. It's gone. But this time, it wasn't just a story shared in a bar or a blurry VHS tape from the 90s. This time, it's logged, time-stamped, and filed under, "We don't know what to do with this." You might not fall asleep easily tonight, but if you do, keep an eye on the sky, just in case. You walk through an iron gate in the redwood forest. The air smells like pine needles, cigar smoke, and money. It's midsummer, and here, beneath towering trees in Northern California, the world's most powerful men gather to roast marshmallows, sip cocktails, and allegedly plan the future. Welcome to Bohemian Grove, where rituals, robes, and rumors blur into one hazy conspiracy. Each July, the Bohemian Club hosts a 2-week retreat for elites, presidents, cabinet members, Fortune 500 CEOs, media moguls, and foreign dignitaries. No press, no women, and definitely no public accountability. What do they do here? Well, that's where things get murky. You stand near a clearing. There's a massive stone owl, 40 feet tall. Robed men chant and perform a ritual called the cremation of care. It looks medieval. There's fire, a pretend human sacrifice, and enough incense to trigger 3 asthma attacks. They call it symbolic, meant to banish the burdens of power. But to outsiders, it looks a lot like a secret society doing cosplay in the woods. One mainstream fact: Bohemian Grove is real. The guest lists are verifiable, the rituals are documented, and notable figures like Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and both Bushes have all attended. Nixon once called it the most faggy goddamn thing you could ever imagine. But he still went. Your quirky tidbit. In 2000, a very determined conspiracy theorist named Alex Jones snuck into the grove and filmed the cremation of care ceremony. The footage went viral. Well, as viral as things got before YouTube, and fueled a new wave of theories about satanic elites and lizard people. As you do. Scientists still argue whether Bohemian Grove is just a grown-up summer camp for stressed-out power brokers or something more. A lot of insiders say it's innocent fun, bonding, golf, puppetry. But others point out that major policy shifts have been traced back to conversations that began here, including the idea for the Manhattan Project. You glance at a table set for dinner. Crystal glasses, gourmet food, men in khakis discussing energy markets and foreign policy. Somewhere, a group performs an all-male musical comedy revue. It's very Skull and Bones meets Broadway. And that's the heart of the unease. No one's saying men can't have weird parties in the forest. But when the guys around the bonfire also happen to run the world, maybe it's okay to ask, what exactly are they discussing between the Scotch and the Shakespearean improv? You walk past the owl again. Its eyes don't blink. Somewhere deep in the trees, someone laughs a little too loudly. And you wonder, just for a moment, if the robes aren't part of the performance but part of the plan. You're in a newsroom. The walls are lined with paper. Headlines, deadlines, red pen edits. Journalists clack away at typewriters, phones ring non-stop, and editors bark for the copy. It's the golden age of print media. But what you don't see, what's hidden just beneath the surface, is a hand reaching in from Langley, Virginia. Welcome to Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA didn't just read the news, it helped write it. During the Cold War, the US government was desperate to control the narrative, not just abroad, but at home too. They needed a way to push their version of events, suppress unfriendly stories, and plant ideas in the minds of everyday Americans. So the CIA recruited journalists, hundreds of them. Some knew, some didn't. Either way, the line between reporting and propaganda blurred like a foggy lens. You sip your coffee, flipping through a morning edition. There's a story about a coup in South America. You wonder, idly, if the reporter was there, or if the piece came straight from a government brief. One mainstream fact. In the 1970s, the Church Committee confirmed that the CIA maintained relationships with dozens of journalists and news outlets, including major ones like Time, Newsweek, and the New York Times. The aim? Influence foreign and domestic public opinion through friendly media assets. Your quirky tidbit? Some of these assets weren't just writers, they were editors, people who decided what made it into the paper and what got spiked. Imagine playing poker with someone who controls the deck and the chips. Scientists still argue whether Operation Mockingbird was a short-lived Cold War relic or the beginning of a permanent fusion between intelligence agencies and media. Officially, the program was said to have ended, but some suspect it merely went underground, renamed and restructured for the digital age. You lean over a desk where a young reporter types a wire story. It's about Soviet aggression, Cuban rebels, Middle East instability. A few sentences feel off, too polished, too perfectly aligned with State Department talking points. You glance over and spot a briefcase under the desk. It's not the reporter's. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just about shaping foreign perception. Mockingbird also worked domestically, feeding narratives that would ensure public support, or at least complacency, for US policy. If you wondered why every paper seemed to echo the same phrasing, same angles, same anonymous sources, well, now you know. The lights in the newsroom flicker. Phones keep ringing. Somewhere, a fax machine spits out another leaked document, and you realize information is power, but only if it's not pre-approved. So the next time you read a quote that feels a little too convenient, remember, there may be more behind that story than just a byline. You're crouched in a hallway at the Watergate Hotel. It's late. The carpet smells like stale bourbon and stress. Down the corridor, 5 men in business suits, not cat burglars, mind you, are quietly trying to break into the Democratic National Committee's office. They've got cameras, tape recorders, gloves, and some very bad luck, because soon they'll get caught. And what begins as a low-stakes break-in will spiral into the biggest political scandal in American history. But Watergate wasn't just a robbery, it was a machine. A tangled mess of lies, hush money, illegal surveillance, secret slush funds, and presidential paranoia. And while the public remembers Nixon's resignation, the real conspiracy lay in everything leading to that moment. You stand in the Oval Office. The president paces. There's a hidden microphone under the desk, capturing every sigh and shred of self-destruction. Nixon didn't just cover up the break-in. He built an entire apparatus to crush dissent and protect power. Think wiretaps on journalists, enemies lists, campaign funds laundered through fake charities. It was less a presidency, more a banana republic with a nicer drapes. One mainstream fact. Nixon resigned in 1974 after the infamous smoking gun tape revealed he had obstructed justice by ordering the FBI to back off the Watergate investigation. It was the first time a US president resigned, and not because of political pressure, but because the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Your quirky tidbit? One of the burglars was a former CIA operative who once organized coups in Latin America. So when he was caught bugging an office in DC, you can imagine the nerves that shot through the intelligence community. He's doing what now? Scientists still argue whether Nixon could have survived the scandal if he'd just thrown the burglars under the bus. Some say the cover-up, not the crime, did him in. Others point out that he created an entire White House unit nicknamed the Plumbers, because their job was to plug leaks, with break-ins. You leaf through a folder marked confidential. Inside, fake letters, forged cables, disinformation campaigns. All part of a bizarre domestic intelligence operation designed to track protesters, sabotage political opponents, and ensure Nixon's hold on power. If that sounds familiar, congratulations. You've seen a few modern headlines. And then there's Deep Throat, the secret source feeding clues to reporters Woodward and Bernstein. Turns out he was Mark Felt, the FBI's associate director, proving that sometimes the whistleblower wears a badge and carries a really thick grudge. You step back out into the hallway, the door still ajar, where the lock was taped open. It's quiet now. But history roared through this place, reminding everyone that power, unchecked, tends to rot from the inside out. You're in a smoke filled room. Not metaphorically, a literal room, thick with cigar smoke, heated debate, and tailored suits. The year is 1933. The Great Depression has America in a chokehold. Franklin D. Roosevelt is pushing sweeping reforms. And a group of wealthy businessmen. They're not thrilled. So they hatch a plan. Not to protest, not to lobby, to overthrow the US government. This is the story of the business plot, a conspiracy so audacious it sounds like a rejected House of Cards script, but it really happened. Or at least, enough of it did to leave a very uncomfortable paper trail. You sit at a long oak table as names get tossed around. DuPont, J.P. Morgan connected men, powerful bankers, industrial tycoons. The goal? Convince 500,000 war veterans to march on Washington, seize control of the government, and install a military-style puppet leadership under a respected figurehead. Someone Americans trusted. Someone who could unify the troops. That someone? Major General Smedley Butler, two-time Medal of Honor recipient, war hero. And as it turned out, not someone who plays well with fascists. One mainstream fact. Butler testified before Congress in 1934 that he had been approached by conspirators asking him to lead a military coup. He blew the whistle instead, and the McCormack-Dickstein Committee confirmed parts of his story, though the full scale remains debated. Your quirky tidbit? The businessman allegedly offered to fund a 500,000-strong citizen army with $3 million, which, adjusted for inflation, is enough to buy a private military, a few yachts, and probably a sports team. Scientists still argue whether the plot was ever viable, or just rich guys blowing off steam with a martini and a military fantasy. Some say it was all smoke and no fire. Others believe it came dangerously close to real. You imagine Butler sitting in his modest office, hearing the pitch. He listens, nods, then reports everything to Congress. It's the kind of reversal that would make for a great twist ending, except it happened in real life. And afterward, no one went to jail. Most of the names were scrubbed from the official report. The whole thing was quickly buried beneath more pressing news. You glance at a yellowed newspaper clipping. It mentions the plot in passing, like a hiccup in history. And that's the strangest part. The attempted fascist coup in America that nobody ever talks about. You lean back. The room is still smoky, but the silence is loud with what-ifs. What if Butler had said yes? What if the veterans had marched? What if the coup had succeeded? It didn't. But the next time someone says, that could never happen here, just smile softly and say, it almost did. You sit in a quiet office in suburban Maryland, the blinds half closed, a stack of papers humming gently beneath your hands. The year is 2005. Your phone buzzes again. It's another alert from a source. Only this time, it's not foreign spies or terrorists you're tracking. It's Americans. All of them. Every call, every text, every email. Welcome to the secret surveillance world that existed before Edward Snowden made it famous. Most people think mass data collection began with the 2013 revelations. But truthfully, the government had been watching, really watching, since long before that. After 9/11, the floodgates opened. Programs like Stellar Wind were launched under the Bush administration, giving the NSA access to vast amounts of digital data. Phone metadata, internet traffic, financial records, all swept up under the vague banner of national security. And it wasn't just foreigners. The net included millions of Americans. You log into your government terminal. A dashboard pops up. A call from Kansas. a browser history from Oregon. Your system filters by keyword: explosives, jihad, birthday cake. Oops, one of those doesn't belong. One mainstream fact: long before Snowden's leak, whistleblowers like William Binney and Thomas Drake tried to sound the alarm internally. They warned that NSA programs were scooping up domestic data illegally, but instead of being heard, they were investigated. Their careers were torched. Their houses were raided. Your quirky tidbit: the NSA once tried to justify mass collection by saying it was just gathering metadata, like the sender and receiver of emails or call times. No big deal, right? Except metadata can paint a disturbingly accurate picture of your life. Who you called, when, where you were, what patterns you follow. It's like tracking someone's shadow to figure out what they're thinking. Scientists still argue whether mass surveillance actually prevents terrorism, or if it simply drowns analysts in a sea of irrelevant data. Statistically, there's little evidence it made a measurable difference in national security outcomes. But once that level of access is granted, it's hard to roll it back. You flip through an old memo labeled PRISM. It's a secret program that lets the NSA pull data directly from tech giants. Facebook, Google, Apple, the works. And they're not fighting it. They're cooperating. You sit back and glance at your phone. It buzzes again. You wonder, for just a second, if anyone's listening right now. Not out of paranoia, but out of probability. And you wouldn't be wrong. Years before the world learned the name Snowden, the machinery was already spinning. Quiet, efficient, deeply unconstitutional, and invisible. Until it wasn't. You walk out of the office, the door hissing shut behind you. Somewhere, in a windowless building with no sign, a hard drive spins, storing more than just data, storing you. You're trudging through dense jungle. The air is thick, buzzing with insects and heavy with heat. The leaves glisten, not with rain, but with chemical residue. You don't know it yet, but this mist, this spray, it's more than just defoliant. It's Agent Orange, and it's going to leave scars deeper than any bullet. During the Vietnam War, the US military launched Operation Ranch Hand, an effort to strip the jungles bare to expose enemy movement. To do that, they sprayed nearly 20 million gallons of herbicides over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The most infamous of these? Agent Orange, named oddly enough for the orange stripe on his storage barrel. You stand by a river. The trees are dead. The fish float belly up. The villagers look older than their years. You don't notice at first, but many children here are sick, misshapen, fragile. This isn't just ecological damage, it's generational. One mainstream fact: Agent Orange contained dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds known to science. It's linked to cancer, birth defects, immune disorders, and a laundry list of grim conditions. For decades, the US government denied or downplayed the health consequences, especially for American veterans exposed during the war. Your quirky tidbit? The original manufacturer, Monsanto, actually warned the US government that dioxin contamination was dangerous. But the military decided the tactical benefits outweighed the unconfirmed risks. Translation: let's keep spraying. Scientists still argue over just how extensive the damage was. Estimates suggest over 3 million people were affected, many of them civilians. And even today, children in Vietnam are born with deformities that doctors believe are linked to dioxin's lingering presence in the soil and water. You walk past an American veteran in a hospital hallway. He's in his 50s, maybe 60s. Skin lesions, diabetes, neuropathy. He says the government took decades to even acknowledge his suffering. And when they finally did, It came with paperwork thicker than a brick and benefits that often arrived too late. But Agent Orange wasn't just about Vietnam. It was tested stateside too, sometimes in secret, often near military bases or rural areas. Soil samples still carried trace evidence, like ghosts clinging to the land. And the kicker? Some companies that made Agent Orange went on to become major agricultural giants, pushing new chemicals, new seeds, new solutions. Different barrel, different name, same orange stripe on history. You breathe in cautiously. The air smells like wet leaves and old wounds. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter blades the sky into ribbons. And below it, a jungle that will take centuries to forgive. You're underground now, not in a bunker, but in the basement of a hospital. The lights buzz overhead. Medical carts rattle down sterile hallways. And somewhere, a lead-lined door clicks shut behind you. Welcome to the forgotten fallout of the Manhattan Project. A program that didn't end with the bomb, but kept testing, measuring, and yes, experimenting, often without anyone's consent. Everyone knows about Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. The mushroom clouds, the fire, the sudden end to World War II. But few know about what came next. Secret human radiation experiments carried out by US scientists on unsuspecting patients and citizens. You open a file. The words classified are stamped across the top in faded ink. Inside, a chart tracking uranium injections into hospital patients. They weren't told. They weren't asked. Some were cancer patients. Others were simply poor or sick or institutionalized. Easy to ignore, easier to experiment on. One mainstream fact. In 1995, President Bill Clinton formally acknowledged and apologized for the government's secret radiation tests conducted between the 1940s and 1970s. A special advisory committee confirmed that many of the test subjects had no idea they were being used in nuclear research. Your quirky tidbit: in one case, researchers injected plutonium into 18 people without telling them what it was. They were tracked for years. Most died. Their corpses were later exhumed to study the long-term effects, all under the guise of public health. Scientists still argue whether these experiments contributed vital knowledge to radiation safety, or were simply a grotesque overreach of power. Either way, the phrase informed consent wasn't part of the vocabulary back then, or if it was conveniently ignored. You move to another drawer and pull out reports from fallout studies. The government released radioactive iodine into the air in some rural areas just to see how far it would spread. They called it research. The locals called it Tuesday. Even cremated remains were sometimes collected and analyzed without family permission, because they offered a chance to measure radiation absorption in bones. Imagine burying a loved one only to find out years later their ashes had been vacuumed for science. And here's the real twist. Much of this took place under the umbrella of national defense. The logic was simple. We had entered the atomic age, and we needed to know what radiation really did to the human body. The ethics? That was someone else's department, or nobody's. You lean back, dizzy with the weight of it. The bomb may have ended a war, but it began a new kind of silent conflict, one waged in labs and hospital rooms, behind curtains and locked filing cabinets. And now you know. The bomb didn't stop exploding in 1945. It just got quieter. You're in a mid-century government office. The fluorescent lights flicker, the water cooler hums, and someone's nervously adjusting a clipboard. You're here for a job, or rather, a security clearance. But first, a strange test. It doesn't measure your typing speed. It doesn't care about your military record. It's designed to figure out if you're gay. Welcome to the bizarre and very real era of the Gaydar Project. During the Cold War, paranoia wasn't limited to communists. The US government launched full-blown investigations into federal employees suspected of being homosexual. They were seen as security risks, blackmail targets, morally compromised, or simply unfit to serve. It sounds absurd now. It was absurd then. But that didn't stop officials from pouring serious resources into weeding out what they called sexual deviance. One mainstream fact: between the 1940s and 1960s, thousands of federal workers lost their jobs under Executive Order 19450, which banned sexual perversion among employees with access to classified information. Translation: being gay could get you fired without cause, trial, or recourse. Your quirky tidbit: in Canada, the government funded an actual fruit machine, not a slot machine, but a supposed device to detect homosexuality. It measured pupil dilation while subjects looked at various images. Think of it as a lie detector crossed with a mood ring, and a healthy dose of 1950s pseudo-science. Scientists still argue whether these efforts were more about maintaining political control, or if they genuinely believed homosexuality could be diagnosed like tuberculosis. Either way, the damage was real. Careers ended, reputations ruined, lives derailed. You sit through an interrogation. The questions are invasive. Do you have any unusual friendships? Have you ever been to a certain bar on 14th Street? You want to ask what this has to do with espionage. But you already know the answer. Nothing. It's not about safety. It's about conformity. What's worse, some agencies encouraged colleagues to inform on one another. Gossip turned into reports. Suspicions became files. Whole floors of bureaucrats lived in fear, not of secrets leaking out, but of being found out. And when actual spies did slip through the cracks, well, they were usually straight and unnoticed because the system was too busy peering into bedroom windows instead of briefcases. You walk out of the building. Behind you, another name is added to the blacklist. No trial, no hearing, just a letter and a quiet suggestion that you leave town. It would take decades for the government to apologize, for policies to be changed, for honor to be restored. And even now, some of those old files remain sealed, along with the truth they tried so hard to suppress. You glance back at the building. The flag outside flutters in the wind. Ironically, it's flying over the land of the free. You're seated in a grand Senate chamber in 1975. The microphones are hot. The air is tense. And men in grey suits are squirming in leather chairs. What's happening here is unprecedented. Congress is about to rip open the sealed vaults of America's most secretive agencies. The CIA, the FBI, the NSA. They're all getting grilled under oath. Welcome to the Church Committee, and the moment America stared into its own surveillance soul. Led by Senator Frank Church, this committee was born in the wake of Watergate, whistleblowers, and a growing public realization that the people in power had, for years, been playing by their own rules. Off the books, behind closed doors, and often far beyond the Constitution. You listen as testimony spills out. A CIA officer admits to plotting assassinations of foreign leaders. An FBI official confirms they mailed anonymous letters to civil rights activists urging them to take their own lives. Each sentence is more unbelievable than the last, until you realize it's all true. One mainstream fact: The Church Committee revealed that U.S. intelligence agencies had engaged in decades of illegal wiretapping, political infiltration, media manipulation, assassination planning, and domestic surveillance, without oversight. Your quirky tidbit? At one point, it was revealed the CIA had developed a poison dart gun disguised as a cigarette. It could kill silently and leave no trace. Somewhere, Q from James Bond took notes. Scientists, historians, and constitutional scholars still argue whether the intelligence agencies were genuinely protecting the nation or simply protecting their turf. The official narrative? Cold War urgency required aggressive tactics. The unofficial truth? They got used to having no rules. You flip through a printed memo. It references H.T. Lingual, a CIA program that secretly opened over 215,000 letters mailed between the US and the Soviet Union. It ran for 20 years. Just imagine licking a stamp and accidentally starring in a spy drama. There's also Operation Shamrock, in which the NSA obtained full access to the telegram traffic of major US telecommunication companies. We're talking decades of wire traffic, copied, reviewed, archived, without a single warrant. And then there's the fallout. The creation of the FISA Court, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and new rules for how agencies could spy on citizens. The Church Committee, in many ways, birthed modern intelligence oversight, or tried to. You watch Church himself speak, warning that if these powers ever turned inward against Americans, the nation's very soul would be at risk. The potential for abuse, he said, is enormous, and there would be no place to hide. You sit back. The lights dim slightly. Somewhere behind a locked door, a redacted file flutters to the floor. History doesn't whisper here. It testifies. You're standing on a remote army base in the 1950s. The sun blazes overhead. A row of young soldiers line up, each one with that nervous but obedient look in their eyes. They think they're part of a standard drill. But what they don't know is that they're about to become human lab rats in a government experiment involving LSD and psychological manipulation. This wasn't a rogue project. It was part of a broader effort by the US military and CIA to understand the effects of hallucinogenic drugs on soldiers, both as a weapon against enemies and a way to control friendly forces. It sounds like a deleted scene from Apocalypse Now, but it happened. You're handed a canteen. You're told to hydrate, but the water has been dosed, just enough to kickstart a trip. Within an hour, you're seeing double, hearing colors, and questioning the meaning of your boots. Meanwhile, doctors and clipboards watch from behind one-way glass, taking notes like it's just another lab day. One mainstream fact. Declassified records confirm that the US Army conducted tests on soldiers using LSD and other hallucinogens as part of research into mind control, combat stress, and enhanced interrogation. Volunteers were rarely informed of the full scope or the risks. Your quirky tidbit. In one test, a group of British soldiers was filmed performing routine drills before and after ingesting LSD. The before footage is textbook military precision. The after. One soldier climbs a tree to feed the birds. Another forgets how to use a door. Scientists still argue whether these experiments offered any real tactical value. Some say it was necessary Cold War research. Others believe it was nothing more than scientific sadism, an expensive exercise in, what if we gave a tank commander a handful of acid? You pick up a report titled, Effects of Psychoactive Compounds on Morale and Judgment. It describes increased suggestibility, paranoia, even episodes of temporary amnesia. Soldiers lost the ability to follow orders, identify friend from foe, or even hold their weapons correctly. You know, the basics. But these weren't just one-off experiments. Some soldiers were dosed repeatedly over weeks. Others were kept awake, given cocktails of hallucinogens, then interrogated to simulate POW scenarios. And when things went sideways, as they often did, many were never debriefed. No apologies, no counseling, just a pat on the back and orders to report for duty the next morning. Years later, some veterans would suffer from persistent psychological issues, flashbacks, paranoia, hallucinations. Most were never told why. You stand quietly in the corner of a now empty barracks, imagining the confusion, the fear, the surreal moments when a soldier realized he wasn't in control, not of his mind, not of his reality, and not of his mission. Sleep tight. And if you start dreaming in kaleidoscope, maybe skip the water bottle in the mess hall. You're somewhere over Southeast Asia, flying low and steady in a cargo plane that's not carrying troops or weapons, but barrels of silver iodide. Your mission isn't to bomb or surveil. It's to make it rain, literally. Welcome to Project Popeye, where weather became a weapon, and the clouds over Vietnam were given military marching orders. During the Vietnam War, the US military sought every possible edge. One clever or completely insane idea: increase rainfall during the monsoon season to flood the Ho Chi Minh Trail, wash out enemy supply lines, and turn jungle paths into swamps. So they seeded clouds with chemicals to force precipitation. The motto? Make mud, not war. You float in the aircraft, watching as flares loaded with silver iodide are launched into the atmosphere. Below, clouds darken. Rain begins to fall. It's unnatural. It's controlled. It's science fiction wrapped in classified memos. One mainstream fact: Project Popeye ran from 1967 to 1972 and was confirmed by the Pentagon in the 1970s after being exposed by a reporter and later acknowledged in Senate hearings. For 5 years, the US actively engaged in weather modification as a military tactic. Your quirky tidbit? The operation was so secret that most pilots involved didn't even know what they were doing. Some were told they were atmospheric testers. Others just followed orders. It wasn't until years later that they realized they'd been altering the literal sky. Scientists still argue whether the increased rainfall made a significant difference in the war. Some believe it extended the monsoon season by 30 to 45 days in key regions. Others say it was too little, too late, more symbolic than strategic. But the implications, huge. It meant the military had crossed a line. Nature itself was now part of the battlefield. And the ethics of that move? Let's just say it triggered serious backlash. After Project Popeye, the UN actually drafted a treaty banning environmental modification as a weapon of war. It's called the NMOD Convention, and it still stands today. You shuffle through a folder labeled Weather Mod, OPSEC Level 5. It reads like a sci-fi novel. Proposed plans included fog creation, drought inducement, and even triggering lightning. You picture generals in a war room, pointing at weather maps, planning storms like airstrikes. The program ended quietly. No grand public announcement. No medals for mud making. Just another closed file in a vault somewhere, buried beneath decades of military innovation and meteorological mischief. Now, when you hear rain tapping on the roof or thunder rumbling in the distance, maybe you'll wonder, just for a second, if somewhere, someone is still flipping the switch. You look up at the sky. It's cloudy again. Go figure. You're seated in a State Department lounge, coffee going cold beside a stack of diplomatic cables. The mood is calm, but behind the scenes, it's anything but. Because while world leaders smile for the cameras, two brothers are quietly reshaping the planet. Meet Alan and John Foster Dulles, a sibling duo with a matching ambition, and matching footprints across half the 20th century's regime changes. John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State under Eisenhower. Alan Dulles, Director of the CIA. Together, they weren't just influencing policy, they were policy. Their coordination allowed foreign coups and secret wars to unfold, almost like family business. And business, as it turned out, was booming. You glance at a map. Iran, Guatemala, Congo. Places where elected leaders were overthrown, replaced with friendlier faces. Friendly, at least, to American corporations. Not always so friendly to their own citizens. One mainstream fact. In 1953, the CIA, under Alan Dulles, engineered a coup to remove Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. His crime? Nationalizing Iran's oil. The Shah was installed in his place. The US government denied involvement for decades before finally admitting it in 2013. Your quirky tidbit? The code name for that operation was T-Pajax, which sounds more like a car wax brand than the blueprint for destabilizing a sovereign government. Scientists and historians still argue whether the Dulles brothers acted out of national security concerns or pure economic interest. John Foster once said America had a duty to defend free enterprise across the globe, and by defend, he seemed to mean topple regimes. The Guatemala coup in 1954 followed a similar script. The government there had threatened to redistribute land, including some owned by the United Fruit Company, a US-based firm that just so happened to be represented by the Dulles brothers' old law firm. Small world, right? You sift through a letter Alan wrote to a station chief abroad. It's all code words and plausible deniability. The language is careful, calculated. You realize this wasn't rogue cowboy behavior. It was policy by pedigree. The Dulles legacy didn't end quietly. After the Bay of Pigs invasion collapsed in 1961, President Kennedy forced Alan Dulles to resign. And yet, oddly enough, Dulles later served on the Warren Commission investigating JFK's assassination. The irony isn't lost on you. You sip your coffee. It's cold now. In the next room, world leaders are shaking hands. But in this room, it's two brothers with matching briefcases who left the world a little more unstable, one coup at a time. And when someone says, the US never meddles in foreign affairs, you'll smile, lean back and say, you've never met the Dulles boys. You're on a Hollywood set, watching a director bark orders through a megaphone. The camera pans across a row of actors dressed as Navy SEALs. The lighting is perfect. The flags are crisp. And somewhere off screen, a quiet figure in a government-issued windbreaker nodding in approval. This isn't just a movie. It's a subtle collaboration. One where the CIA doesn't need to censor a thing, because they've already helped write the script. Welcome to the blurred world where the CIA quietly helped shape Hollywood, trading access for influence and making sure America's enemies look extra evil. And America? Well, she always saves the day. This didn't start yesterday. It's been happening for decades. Films, TV shows, documentaries, many received input, oversight, or support from intelligence agencies. Sometimes it's practical. We'll let you use this aircraft carrier if you tweak the ending. Sometimes it's more subtle. This character? maybe let's not mention the torture thing. One mainstream fact. In 2016, over 800 documents were released showing how the Pentagon and CIA had influenced scripts for over 800 movies and 1,000 television shows. Titles included Zero Dark 30, Argo, Homeland, and even family-friendly hits like Transformers. Your quirky tidbit? The CIA once rewrote the ending of the 2012 movie, The Recruit, to ensure the agency didn't appear to be too manipulative. The irony practically writes itself. Scientists still argue whether this kind of influence is harmless patriotism or a subtle form of propaganda. After all, when's the last time you saw a spy thriller where the US is actually the bad guy? You don't, because that script rarely gets greenlit. You glance through a redacted memo titled Public Affairs Review, Script Clearance. It's a government document commenting on character arcs, wardrobe, and whether or not a scene supports national values. You suddenly realize someone in Langley reads scripts for a living. Even the recruitment videos got a glow-up. The CIA's YouTube channel, for example, now has slick cinematic trailers that look like they belong on Netflix. Clean cuts, ominous voiceovers, soft focus. You half expect Jason Bourne to leap from a black SUV, and yet the influence goes deeper. Films shape perception. They paint the intelligence community as noble, conflicted heroes, never bored desk jockeys writing reports for 8 hours a day. The grey areas, glossed over, the casualties carefully cropped. You wonder what other stories didn't make it past the notes. Scripts that told too much truth, characters who asked too many questions, plots that hit a little too close to real classified history. The camera claps, scene's done. But the real production? It never ends. You step off the set, past the trailers, past the security, and into the quiet fog of make-believe. Just don't be surprised when your popcorn comes with a little side of psyops. You're inside a government accounting office, or at least you think that's what it is. The lights are dim, the computers are outdated, and the numbers, they don't make sense. Budgets balloon, transactions disappear, and somewhere behind a locked door, a black ledger tracks the untrackable. Welcome to the world of the black budget, the shadow financial system funding America's most secret programs. Every year, Congress approves trillions in spending. Most of it is public. Roads, education, defense. But a hidden portion, tens of billions annually, goes to classified programs. They don't show up on normal spreadsheets. They're buried deep in defense allocations, under labels like other procurement or special activities. These aren't just numbers. They're the fuel behind spy satellites, experimental aircraft, and projects we may never know existed. One mainstream fact. In 2013, documents leaked by Edward Snowden revealed that the US intelligence black budget that year was over $52.6 billion, spread across agencies like the NSA, CIA, and NRO. That's more than the entire GDP of some countries. Your quirky tidbit? A 2018 audit of the Pentagon found that over $800 million in advanced aviation threat funding was unaccounted for. That's bureaucrat speak for, we lost track of a very expensive toy. Scientists, economists, and watchdogs still argue whether the black budget is a necessary shield for national security, or a convenient cloak for waste, fraud, and the occasional science experiment gone rogue. Either way, it's money without sunlight, power without receipts. You flip through a heavily redacted report. It's got a few legible lines. Tested propulsion unit, exceeded expected speeds, recovered materials under analysis. Then, a long streak of black ink. Your eyebrows rise. The budget line. Just a number. $3.2 billion. No explanation. No oversight. The problem isn't just the secrecy. It's the scale. Over time, the black budget becomes its own ecosystem. One that's hard to audit and nearly impossible to challenge. Even senators on defense committees admit they often don't know where the money goes. One famously said, "We vote for the budget blind." Rumors persist of underground bases, prototype aircraft shaped like triangles, mind control research, genetic experiments. Most of it is probably exaggerated, but the fact remains, you wouldn't even know if it wasn't. And let's not forget the private contractors. Major firms receive billions through black budget channels. They don't have to report publicly. They're protected by classification. They could be building drones, lasers, or something else entirely. You stare at the balance sheet. Some of the numbers are blank. Others are labeled special access only. You imagine a giant vault somewhere, like the Pentagon crossed with Area 51, full of gadgets, prototypes, and plans that never left the drawing board. Then you remember, in 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld admitted the Pentagon couldn't account for $2.3 trillion in spending. The next day was September 11th. The announcement was forgotten. The audit? Postponed indefinitely. You close the folder. It's just one more page in a book full of invisible ink. You're sitting in a town hall in the Deep South during the 1960s. The lights buzz overhead. Folding chairs creak. Someone sets out lemonade. It looks like a neighborhood meeting, a place for people with hoods and burning crosses to plan their next move. But you notice something strange. One of the most vocal Klan leaders seems off, polished, oddly well-informed, and very, very good at collecting names. That's because he's not a Klansman at all. He's an FBI agent. Welcome to the strange reality of the FBI's fake KKK chapters. A deeply weird and ethically murky strategy where law enforcement infiltrated white supremacist groups, not just to spy, but sometimes to create them. It sounds impossible. But during the era of COINTELPRO, the Bureau didn't just infiltrate civil rights and black nationalist organizations. They also got cozy with white hate groups, sometimes even founding their local chapters. The idea? Monitor domestic extremism. The result? A confusing legacy of entrapment, influence, and a whole lot of deeply uncomfortable tactics. One mainstream fact. In the 1960s, the FBI ran multiple undercover operations against the Klan. One agent, Gary Thomas Rowe, was later revealed to have participated in and possibly enabled violent acts while on the Bureau's payroll. Your quirky tidbit. Rowe, while undercover, was present during the infamous attack on Freedom Riders in Alabama. He later admitted he'd been aware of the plan beforehand. The Bureau? They'd been told, but did nothing to stop it. Scientists and historians still argue whether these tactics did more harm than good. Was the FBI preventing violence, or just documenting it? Did agents cross a line from observer to agitator? The files, what's left of them, don't provide easy answers. You flip through one now. It's an internal memo marked confidential. White extremist org. The language is cold. Assets placed in leadership role. Group encouraged to continue activities for further intelligence gathering. You pause. That doesn't sound like de-escalation. That sounds like fanning the flames. And then there's the question of collateral damage. If your undercover agent is helping write speeches, rallying recruits, or even driving the getaway car, where does the surveillance end and complicity begin? You picture a small-town sheriff getting reports from the FBI about a new Klan chapter forming in his jurisdiction. He doesn't know it's run by an agent. He just knows the cross-burnings have increased. The threats are real, and the fear, absolutely justified. Even within the Bureau, not everyone was on board. Some agents reportedly pushed back. Others viewed it as just part of the job. Either way, there are names in those files. Real people whose lives were changed by men who wore two faces and served one master, the badge. You look around the town hall. The meeting's wrapping up. The agent stands, nods politely, and collects the list of new members. It'll be in Washington by morning. And you're left with this thought. Sometimes the call really is coming from inside the house. You're walking through a warehouse in the early 1980s. The air heavy with the smell of gasoline and dust. Crates are stacked high. Some marked with strange initials. Others with no labels at all. Men in aviator sunglasses nod as bundles are loaded into trucks. But these aren't government supplies. They're bricks of cocaine. And somehow, this entire operation ties back to the CIA. Welcome to one of the most controversial chapters in American intelligence history. The allegation that the CIA was complicit, or at the very least willfully blind, to drug trafficking operations that fueled the crack epidemic in American cities. It begins with the Contras, anti-communist rebel groups in Nicaragua funded covertly by the US in the 1980s. The Reagan administration desperately wanted them to win. Congress, however, passed laws to prevent direct funding, so money had to come from somewhere. Enter the drug trade. One mainstream fact: in the mid-1990s, journalist Gary Webb published a bombshell series called Dark Alliance, alleging that cocaine trafficked by CIA-connected networks was funneled into Los Angeles and helped ignite the crack cocaine explosion. The CIA, he claimed, knew and looked the other way. Your quirky tidbit? One of the key drug traffickers, Freeway Rick Ross, later became famous twice, first as a kingpin and then as the man whose name was co-opted by a rapper. He claimed he had no idea his suppliers were connected to US intelligence, just that the money never seemed to run out. Scientists, historians, and government watchdogs still argue over the extent of the CIA's involvement. The agency conducted internal investigations in response to public outrage. Their findings? Essentially, we didn't directly fund drug dealers, but we might have been in the same room, with our eyes closed and fingers in our ears. The nuance didn't calm anyone, especially in black communities devastated by crack-related violence and mass incarceration. The idea that a government agency might have tolerated drug imports while waging a war on drugs at home felt like cruel irony baked into national policy. You flip through a declassified Inspector General's report. It's 600 pages long. The takeaway: there's no smoking gun, but a whole lot of smoke. Warnings ignored, informants protected, flights unchecked. The paper trail is more like a paper smog. Meanwhile, entire neighborhoods were left reeling. Prisons filled, families fractured, and somewhere, money flowed uphill, funding covert wars while the streets burned below. And here's a bitter cherry on top. When Webb's reporting made national waves, he was widely discredited. Major outlets, instead of investigating the story, went after him. He eventually lost his job and died in 2004, under tragic, still debated circumstances. Years later, his work was partially vindicated, but the damage, to him and to the communities he wrote about, was already done. You leave the warehouse. A truck door slams shut behind you. Somewhere inside, the truth is packed up tight, hidden between a crate of guns and a shipment of lies. You're flipping through a college newspaper in 1969. Protesters shout outside. A chalkboard inside lists names of students being watched, some circled in red. It's not campus gossip. It's government surveillance, and it's got its own code name, Operation Chaos. It sounds like the title of a Cold War spy novel, but this was a very real CIA program aimed at monitoring and infiltrating the anti-war movement. Yes, inside the US. Despite the CIA's charter forbidding domestic operations, Chaos did just that, tracking tens of thousands of Americans who dared to question the Vietnam War. You scan the documents. They're filled with names, affiliations, even grocery store receipts. Anyone attending protests, writing critical op-eds, or organizing sit-ins might suddenly have a thick file in Langley. Students, artists, veterans, mums, doesn't matter. If you had a Stop the War bumper sticker, congratulations. You are now of interest to the most powerful intelligence agency in the world. One mainstream fact. In the mid-1970s, the Church Committee confirmed the CIA had collected files on over 300,000 individuals and groups under Operation Chaos and related efforts, despite having no authority to operate domestically. Your quirky tidbit? Chaos wasn't alone. It was joined by sibling programs like Project Resist and Project Merrimack, which involved agents attending protests, posing as fellow activists, and sometimes giving passionate speeches just to see who clapped. Scientists and historians still argue whether the CIA acted out of genuine fear of foreign subversion, or simply equated dissent with disloyalty. Internal documents often cited concern that the Soviets were funding anti-war groups. But most of the people targeted were just regular citizens who didn't want their friends, siblings, or children dying in the jungle. You peer into a student meeting. The air smells like sweat and stale coffee. A new member joins. He asks too many questions, takes too many notes. He's polite, but wrong in small, important ways. You already know he's not here to protest. He's here to report. The psychological effect of all this? Chilling. People started to whisper, to hesitate, to worry that their study group was actually a sting operation. Trust broke down, even in movements built on solidarity. And sometimes that was the goal. You flip to the end of a report. It ends with the words, "No foreign influence confirmed." That's the punchline. After years of surveillance, the CIA found no substantial evidence that anti-war movements were Soviet-controlled. But they kept spying anyway. You walk past a bulletin board covered in flyers. One reads, "Free speech is not a crime." Another, "Peace now." Ironically, the CIA probably has both of them in a file somewhere, just in case. The war eventually ended. The protests, the paranoia, the paper trails, they faded into history. But the lesson stuck. Questioning power can get you labeled an enemy, even if all you did was say, "This doesn't feel right." You're standing in a clinic in the 1970s, filling out paperwork. The nurse smiles politely, guides you to the exam room, and says they'll just do a quick procedure. You trust them. Why wouldn't you? It's a government-funded hospital. But what you don't know is that you're about to be sterilized, without consent, without explanation, and without any way to reverse it. You're young, indigenous, and considered unfit to reproduce. This is the horrific legacy of the Native American sterilization program, a policy hidden behind medical jargon and bureaucratic coldness. It was real, it was widespread, and it was justified as public health. During the 1960s and 1970s, the Indian Health Service, IHS, overseen by the US government, performed thousands of sterilizations on Native American women, many without informed consent. Some were told it was birth control. Others weren't told anything at all. One mainstream fact, a 1966 report from the Government Accountability Office found that 4 IHS service areas had sterilized 3,506 Native women between 1973 and 1966. This didn't include earlier cases or other regions, meaning the true number is likely far higher. Your quirky tidbit? Some women were sterilized after giving birth by C-section. They woke up thinking their family was just beginning, only to find out it had already ended. Others were asked to sign forms while sedated or under anesthesia. Scientists, anthropologists, and human rights activists still argue how much of this was deliberate eugenics versus institutional racism wrapped in policy. But the effects were unmistakable. Entire tribal communities saw a sudden and sharp decline in birth rates. Generational trauma took root. You read a medical file. The form is blank under patient understanding. There's no signature, just a checkbox marked complete. One woman recalled being told her sterilization would be reversible. It wasn't. And when she sued, she was told the statute of limitations had expired. Many of the victims were teenagers. Some were as young as 15. Others were coerced with threats, told they'd lose access to welfare or healthcare if they didn't agree. Some didn't even speak English. You step outside the clinic. The sun's bright, but it doesn't feel warm. There's a silence hanging over the community, a missing generation, a wound not visible in the mirror, but passed down in stories, in mistrust, in mourning. In 2022, tribal leaders and activists began pushing for full acknowledgement, reparations, and formal apologies. Some states have responded. Most haven't. The federal government has never issued a formal public apology for the sterilizations. And perhaps the most haunting part, similar programs were run across marginalized communities, including black women in the South, Puerto Rican women, and the mentally disabled. Eugenics may sound like something out of a 1930s horror story, but in America, it wore a lab coat and called itself progress. You walk away from the clinic, the papers still unsigned in your hand. You didn't ask for this. You never had the choice. You're seated in a dimly lit hotel bar in the early 1960s. The atmosphere is tense. Jazz murmurs from a speaker, but the conversation at your table cuts through the mood like a razor. Across from you sits a man in a tailored suit with slicked back hair and the smooth confidence of someone who's negotiated things most people shouldn't know about. You're in the presence of the mob, and the CIA wants their help. Yes, the United States government once partnered with the Mafia to try and assassinate Fidel Castro. Because when political assassinations get tricky, apparently it's handy to call in professionals. The story begins in the Cold War frenzy. Castro had overthrown a US-friendly regime in Cuba and nationalized American assets. Washington was furious, and the CIA desperately wanted him gone. They just needed someone who could make it look like an accident. So they reached out to the mobsters who'd lost casinos, clubs, and influence when Castro came to power. One mainstream fact. In 1975, the Church Committee revealed that the CIA had contacted mafia figures, including Sam Giancana and Santo Trafficante, to assist in plots to kill Castro, offering payments and legal leniency in return. Your quirky tidbit. One plan involved lacing Castro's favorite cigars with a deadly toxin. Another aimed to dust his diving suit with fungus to make him sick. And one particularly strange attempt, slipping him a depilatory to make his beard fall out and humiliate him on live TV. You can't make this up. Scientists, historians, and ethicists still argue whether these partnerships were strategic necessity or sheer desperation. Regardless, the logic was this. If anyone knows how to pull off a discreet hit, it's the guys who've done it before breakfast. You lean over the bar as a bartender pours a whiskey. 2 booths down, another figure in a fedora is taking notes. Maybe a CIA handler, maybe a guy from Chicago, maybe both. The lines are blurry when everyone involved knows how to keep a secret and how to make someone disappear. And it wasn't just about cigars and wetsuits. There were poison pills hidden in hotel rooms. Secret assassination teams trained in Florida. Even a proposed exploding seashell designed to catch Castro's eye during a dive. Spoiler alert, none of it worked. Castro lived to be 90, despite being the target of over 600 assassination attempts, depending on who's counting. At some point, he probably had to laugh, or maybe just double-check every cigar. You close a file labeled Operation Mongoose. Inside are typed memos, meeting minutes, and a line that simply reads, "Target is resourceful. Recommend external assets." And that, in the end, is the most surreal part. The CIA, the most powerful intelligence agency in the world, hired hitmen. It was like asking wolves to babysit the hen house. Or in this case, to kill a rooster. With a really stylish beard. You take a sip. The bar feels colder now. History has a way of doing that. You're at the edge of the Arizona desert in 2009. The sun's high, the landscape cracked and dry. A border town hums in the distance. You lean against a federal SUV, watching as agents prepare to do something that sounds so wildly illogical, you almost think you misheard. They're about to let criminals walk away with guns. On purpose. This is Operation Fast and Furious, and it's not the movie. You're in the real version, and nobody's driving cool cars away from explosions. Run by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF. The idea was to sell firearms to suspected traffickers and then track the weapons as they moved up the cartel food chain in Mexico. A gunwalking strategy. The goal: nab high-level players instead of just street-level dealers. The result? A disaster. One mainstream fact: the ATF allowed more than 2,000 firearms to walk, meaning they were sold to known criminals in the hopes of monitoring their distribution. Most of the guns were never tracked, and many ended up at crime scenes, including the 2010 murder of U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry. Your quirky tidbit? Some of the guns were AK-47s and .50 caliber rifles, the kind that can take down aircraft and punch through engine blocks. Not exactly subtle tools for your average drug runner. One trafficker bought 34 weapons in a single day and walked away smiling. Scientists and law enforcement experts still argue whether the ATF genuinely thought the plan would work or if it was a rogue experiment doomed from the start. There were already red flags early on: guns vanishing, surveillance lapses, agents raising concerns. But the program continued for over a year. You sit in an ATF office watching surveillance footage. A man loads trunk after trunk with weapons purchased legally in Arizona. He's on every watch list you've got, and yet he's allowed to drive off again. Agents are furious. Some resign. Others leak documents. Eventually, whistleblowers go public. The scandal explodes. Congress gets involved. The Department of Justice scrambles. The fallout reaches the highest levels. In 2012, Attorney General Eric Holder is held in contempt of Congress, the first sitting cabinet member in U.S. history to receive that distinction. But beyond the politics, the human cost is staggering. Guns from Operation Fast and Furious have been found at hundreds of crime scenes across Mexico and the United States. Cartel leaders got stronger. Innocents got caught in the crossfire. You flip through the case file. The final page lists recovered weapons, many from ambushes and mass graves. There's a small typed note at the bottom. Tracking terminated, target unknown. It's the kind of phrase that sticks with you. A mission that started with a strategy, however flawed, ended in chaos, death, and denial. You glance across the border. Somewhere out there, another rifle lies buried in sand, waiting to be found. A souvenir from a plan that sounded smarter in the briefing room. You're in the middle of the Great Plains, maybe Kansas or Nebraska. Rolling fields stretch out around you, and the only sounds are a distant tractor and the rustling of corn. It feels remote, safe, ordinary, but above you, a government satellite silently maps every acre, not for spying on enemies, but for measuring crop yields, without asking. Welcome to the strange under-the-radar tale of government weather satellites and covert agricultural surveillance. Starting in the 1970s, the US launched a series of Landsat satellites. Officially, they were for environmental research and land monitoring. But unofficially, they were also gathering detailed agricultural data, sometimes without farmers' knowledge or permission. From space, the government was watching what you planted, how much it grew, and when it was harvested. You kneel beside a soybean row, unaware that a satellite has already calculated your potential yield. It's watching soil moisture, chlorophyll levels, and vegetation indexes. Meanwhile, you're just worried about the weevils. One mainstream fact: Landsat data was routinely analyzed by USDA and intelligence agencies to assess US food supply, and even to gauge Soviet harvests. It helped drive commodity pricing, trade decisions, and, quietly, military planning. After all, a hungry country is a desperate country. Your quirky tidbit? During the Cold War, some analysts used satellite crop images to predict Soviet food shortages before the Soviet government publicly admitted them. It was the agricultural equivalent of reading their diary through a telescope. Scientists still argue whether this program blurred the line between scientific research and economic surveillance. Farmers, especially in the US, weren't always told how their data was being used, or whether it was being sold, shared, or used to influence global markets. You scan a 1982 memo marked for internal use only. It outlines remote sensing priorities, including not just crop health, but farm size, irrigation behavior, and non-compliance indicators. Translation: they weren't just watching crops, they were watching you. The data helped enforce farm subsidy programs and monitor compliance with soil conservation rules. Helpful? Arguably. Creepy? Definitely. And the fact that it was happening from orbit, without public awareness, made it feel more like sci-fi than civic oversight. And here's the kicker. The satellite data wasn't just used by government agencies. Over time, it trickled down to private agribusiness giants, some of whom used it to get a leg up on small farmers in commodity markets. You look up at the blue sky. Somewhere up there, a satellite lens quietly clicks. It's not spying on enemies, it's counting corn stalks. But it reminds you of something important. Surveillance doesn't always look like a wiretap or a drone. Sometimes it's just a quiet eye watching your tractor from space. You turn back to your field. You've been part of a global intelligence map this whole time, and you didn't even know it. You're in a bustling public health clinic in 1961. The mood is hopeful. Polio is on the run. Parents clutch their children's hands. Nurses smile reassuringly. And the new vaccine is flowing out like salvation in tiny paper cups and syringes. But lurking within millions of those doses is something no one expected. A virus, not polio, not measles, but SV40, a simian virus with an uncertain legacy. Yes, this is the uncomfortable truth behind a forgotten chapter in medical history. The polio vaccine contamination scandal, where millions of Americans were unknowingly exposed to a monkey virus that may, or may not, be linked to cancer. You sit at a desk, reading a memo dated 1960. The language is clinical, detached. Presence of simian virus confirmed in poliovirus cultures. That's it. No alarm, no press release, no calls to halt distribution. The vaccine rollout continued, and so did the exposure. One mainstream fact: between 1955 and 1963, an estimated 10 to 30 million people in the United States received polio vaccines contaminated with SV40, a virus found in the kidney cells of monkeys used to grow the vaccine. Your quirky tidbit? Researchers later discovered SV40 DNA in certain human tumors, particularly brain, bone, and mesothelioma cancers. The CDC initially confirmed this, then quietly updated its statements to sound a lot more vague. Scientists still argue fiercely about SV40's role in human disease. Some claim the contaminated vaccines contributed to increased cancer risks in specific populations. Others argue the virus had no effect at all. But no one denies this. It was there, and no one told the public until years later. You scan the research timeline. In 1960, SV40 is found. In 1961, scientists publish findings in peer-reviewed journals. By 1963, new safety protocols are adopted. But during those key early years, the vaccine stayed in circulation. Why? Officials feared that halting the rollout would spark public panic and endanger the fight against polio. Ethically grey? That's putting it mildly. You're left with a terrible trade-off. Protect the population from polio, but expose millions to something else, something unknown. The irony? SV40 wasn't even discovered through vaccine testing. It was found during unrelated research on monkey cells. When they traced it back, they realized the contaminated cells were used in polio vaccine production. Oops. You close a file marked Retrospective Analysis, Tumor Tissues. It's filled with arguments both for and against causality, but one phrase stands out. Evidence inconclusive, but public disclosure not advised. Imagine hearing that in a press briefing. To this day, most Americans don't know they received SV40 with their polio protection. And while today's vaccines are rigorously tested, the legacy of that quiet contamination remains, a reminder that sometimes the miracle cure comes with a footnote. Or, in this case, a virus no one asked for. You look down at your arm. The old scar from that sugar cube or needle is barely visible. But the questions, they still linger. You're tiptoeing through a quiet town in Pennsylvania in 1971. Snow crunches underfoot. You're dressed in black, gloves pulled tight, a crowbar tucked beneath your coat. You're not a burglar, at least not in the usual sense. Tonight, you're about to break into an FBI field office to steal the truth, and what you find will shake the entire country. This is the story of the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, a group of 8 everyday Americans, teachers, professors, students, who pulled off one of the boldest heists in US history, not for money, not for fame, but to expose how deeply the Bureau had embedded itself into the private lives of citizens. The operation was simple. While the world was distracted by the Ali Frazier boxing match, the group used lockpicks and inside intel to slip into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They emptied file cabinets into suitcases, loaded up boxes, and disappeared into the night. One mainstream fact. Among the stolen documents was the first ever public mention of COINTELPRO, the FBI's covert campaign of spying, sabotage, and psychological warfare against civil rights groups, anti-war activists, and others deemed subversive. Your quirky tidbit. One of the original burglars later admitted they almost abandoned the plan entirely, until one of them found a note scrawled on a file labeled Black Student Agitators, with chilling instructions to increase paranoia. That sealed it. Scientists and historians still argue whether this break-in was an act of illegal vigilante activism or one of the most important acts of whistleblowing in American history. But the results, undeniable. The public outcry over COINTELPRO led to congressional investigations, including the Church Committee, and widespread reforms in intelligence oversight. You sit in a dim apartment later that week, watching as pages are photocopied and anonymously mailed to newspapers. One package goes to the Washington Post, another to NBC. Most major outlets hesitate. It's illegal material. But finally, one brave reporter runs with it. The floodgates open. The FBI scrambles. A massive manhunt is launched. Every suspect in town is questioned, but the burglars stay silent. Not one of the 8 is ever caught. Their identities remained a secret for over 40 years, until several finally revealed themselves in a 2014 documentary. You glance through a scan of one of the memos. It is necessary to disrupt these groups. Another, neutralize leadership. Another, no indication of criminal activity, but recommend continued surveillance. You can almost feel the anger of the American public as they realize their own government, not foreign enemies, have been treating them like threats, simply for organizing, protesting, or writing letters. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful part of this story. It wasn't leaked by a disgruntled insider. It wasn't dumped online. It was physically taken, stolen like oxygen from a locked room, and handed, piece by piece, back to the people it belonged to. You look down at your gloved hands, imagining what it must have felt like to open that first drawer, to pull out the truth and realize it had been hiding in plain sight all along. You're in a nondescript compound somewhere outside of Warsaw. The air is still. The buildings are colorless, low to the ground. No signage, no flags, no law. This isn't a prison. At least, not officially. This is a black site, a covert CIA detention facility, where the rules don't apply, and the people held here, they disappear off the map. After 9/11, the US government launched a global campaign to dismantle terrorist networks. But behind the headlines, a secret network of extraordinary rendition programs emerged, where detainees were snatched from one country, flown to another, and locked away in CIA-operated prisons. No trial, no oversight, no due process. One mainstream fact. In 2014, the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee released a heavily redacted report confirming that the CIA had operated multiple secret prisons abroad, including in Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Thailand, and Afghanistan, where detainees were subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques. Your quirky tidbit: the CIA paid foreign governments to host these sites, millions of dollars in cash. In Poland's case, the payoff allegedly included help funding a new intelligence center. Torture with a construction bonus, essentially. Scientists and legal scholars still argue whether these actions qualified as torture under international law. The CIA called it enhanced interrogation, but descriptions from the Senate report included waterboarding, forced rectal feeding, sleep deprivation for up to 180 hours, and mock burials. Semantics can't soften the horror. You're inside one of these facilities now, walking down a hallway dimly lit by a single bulb. There's no sound except for distant, muffled coughing. No windows, no clocks. Just sensory dislocation. That's part of the point. Confuse the detainee. Strip away time, identity, memory. The flights that transported these prisoners were part of an elaborate cover system. Private planes under fake names, refueling in friendly nations, avoiding airspace where human rights watchdogs might be watching. Every move, every transfer, was layered in plausible deniability. You flip through a logbook. No names, only numbers. Detainee number 17 was held for 600 days, never charged, interrogated 100 times. One entry reads, "Uncooperative, apply pressure." And it wasn't just about extracting intelligence. Often, no actionable info was ever obtained. Some detainees were eventually released, cleared of any wrongdoing, but left physically and mentally shattered. Others, never seen again. Eventually, legal pressure and international outrage forced many black sites to shut down. President Obama officially ended the CIA's detention program in 2009. But questions remain. Where else were prisoners taken? What wasn't in the Senate report? How many sites still operate in the shadows? You step out into the night. The compound behind you is silent, anonymous. But history doesn't forget as easily as governments hope it will. These sites were real. These people were real. And the scars, physical and political, still haven't faded. You glance at the stars above. Somewhere, there's a constellation that might spell out never again. But down here, the lights flicker on again behind a concrete wall. You're standing on a busy Tehran street in 1953. The air smells like grilled lamb and engine fumes. And posters of a popular Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, flutter on walls across the city. He's not a tyrant. He's a national hero. His crime: nationalizing Iran's oil industry, previously controlled by British companies. The West doesn't like that. So the CIA decides it's time for a little change in leadership, quietly, strategically, and completely illegally. This is Operation Ajax, America's first modern covert regime change, and the beginning of a long, bitter legacy in the Middle East. The plan was elegant in its design, sloppy in execution, and devastating in its outcome. Working with British intelligence, the CIA funneled money to Iranian mobs, bribed officials, distributed fake news, and staged protests. The goal? Create enough chaos to justify removing Mossadegh and restoring the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to absolute power. One mainstream fact. In 2013, 60 years later, the CIA declassified documents officially admitting to orchestrating the coup. They didn't just support it, They designed it, ran it, and considered it a smashing success. Your quirky tidbit? One of the main agents on the ground, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, reportedly paid street thugs to pose as communists and attack mosques. It helped stir anti-Mossadegh sentiment. Also, it's not every day an actual Roosevelt helps overthrow a foreign government while staying at a fancy Tehran hotel. Scientists and historians still argue whether the coup was driven by Cold War fears of Soviet influence or by oil, pure and simple. Britain had a lot to lose when Iran took its oil back. The US just wanted to keep Iran out of Moscow's orbit. Either way, the people of Iran weren't consulted. You wander through the palace after the dust settles. Mossadegh is under house arrest. The Shah returns in a US-supplied jet. His regime becomes increasingly authoritarian. Secret police, torture chambers, dissident crackdowns, all of it backed quietly by American dollars and American training. The short-term win for the CIA? Secured oil contracts and a loyal ally in the region. The long-term cost? Enormous resentment. 2 decades later, that resentment explodes into the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the hostage crisis, and an adversarial relationship that still reverberates today. You leaf through a memo labeled Tudeh Party Influence. It talks about preemptive measures and stabilizing the region. The language is clean, sanitized. Nowhere does it say, we're toppling a democracy to protect corporate profits and Cold War chess pieces. And here's the kicker. Operation Ajax became a blueprint. Guatemala, Congo, Chile. The US learned how to destabilize nations without firing a single shot, just enough propaganda, payoffs, and plausible deniability. You step onto that Tehran street once more. The same buildings, a different flag, and a future rewritten by men in suits half a world away. Democracy died here, not with a bang, but with a bribe. You're deep inside a high-tech lab, fluorescent lights humming above sealed refrigeration units. Warning signs cover the doors. Biohazard, level 4 containment, authorized personnel only. You expect precision, protocols, discipline. But sometimes, even in the most secure places, someone forgets to lock the fridge. And sometimes, what's inside isn't leftovers, but deadly viruses. Welcome to the unsettling truth about the CDC's lost pathogen samples. It sounds like a tabloid headline. Government loses smallpox vials. But that's exactly what happened. In 2014, a team of scientists at the National Institutes of Health discovered forgotten vials of smallpox in an old freezer. Smallpox, one of the deadliest diseases in human history, was thought to exist in just 2 secure labs worldwide. Now suddenly, it was chilling next to some expired reagents in a storage closet. One mainstream fact: the CDC confirmed the discovery of 6 vials labeled variola, smallpox, at an unregistered storage facility. Some of the samples were still viable, meaning they could, in theory, infect people. Your quirky tidbit? When they tested the freezer's contents, they also found old samples of tularemia, botulinum toxin, and other nasty surprises. It was like finding a biological horror museum in Tupperware. Scientists still argue how these vials ended up there, and more importantly, how many more might be unaccounted for. Because this wasn't a one-off. Over the past few decades, there have been multiple incidents where dangerous pathogens were misplaced, mishandled, or accidentally shipped to the wrong labs. You flip through a 2009 report. Dozens of incidents involving anthrax, avian flu, and even SARS being sent to facilities without proper clearance. In some cases, lab workers were exposed. In others, samples went missing entirely, never recovered. The CDC, of course, has rules, strict ones, but the human factor always finds a way to break them. In 2015, an Army lab in Utah mistakenly shipped live anthrax to nearly 200 facilities worldwide over the course of a decade. The kicker: they thought it was dead the whole time. You peer into a biosafety cabinet. The glove ports are empty. The lights flicker. There's a sense of eerie stillness in rooms built to contain chaos. But when people get complacent, even here, the consequences can leak out, silently. To be fair, most of these mistakes didn't lead to outbreaks or fatalities, but they exposed a sobering truth. Even in the most secure labs on Earth, human error is the wild card. A mislabeled box, a forgotten freezer, a technician who skips a step at the end of a long shift. You check a manifest. The box is marked inactive. But history tells you to be skeptical. In the race to study diseases, sometimes the deadliest thing isn't what's inside the vial. It's what's not in the logbook. You close the freezer. Slowly, carefully. And maybe this time, someone remembers to write it down. You're standing beneath the marble dome of the US Treasury in late 2008. The air is stale with tension and burnt coffee. Wall Street is unraveling, banks are collapsing, and the phrase of the year is too big to fail. So the government steps in, not with pennies, but with trillions. But here's the twist. Most people never found out who got the money or how much they really received. Welcome to the murky waters of the 2008 bailout secret recipients. Officially, the bailout was called the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, and it created the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP for short. Congress publicly approved $700 billion to stabilize the financial system. That alone caused a national outcry. But behind closed doors, the Federal Reserve handed out far more, quietly and without telling Congress. You glance at a Federal Reserve balance sheet. The numbers are dizzying, not billions, trillions, and not just to American banks. Foreign banks, international insurance firms, even hedge funds were quietly receiving loans, liquidity, and backdoor bailouts. One mainstream fact: in 2011, after intense pressure and a lawsuit, the Fed was forced to reveal that between 2007 and 2010, it had issued over $16 trillion in emergency loans, most of them in secret at the time. Your quirky tidbit? One of the single largest recipients wasn't even a bank. It was GE, General Electric, who lobbied to be reclassified as a bank holding company, just so they could qualify for Fed support. They walked away with nearly $16 billion. Scientists and economists still argue whether these emergency programs save the economy or just socialize risk while privatizing profit. Some say the actions were necessary to avoid a global depression. Others argue it was legalized looting by the financial elite. You flip through a loan schedule. Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, all received hundreds of billions in support. Some loans had interest rates below 1%. Others had zero interest. That's not a loan. That's a gift with a receipt. Meanwhile, back in the real world, average Americans were losing homes, jobs, and retirement savings. The foreclosure crisis displaced millions, but no criminal charges were filed against the executives who caused the meltdown. And instead of too big to fail being fixed, most of those banks got bigger. You step into a hearing room on Capitol Hill. A congressman asks where the money went. The Fed chairman smiles, shrugs, and replies, "We don't have to tell you." It's not a movie line. That actually happened. Eventually, some reforms were passed. Dodd-Frank, new oversight boards. But the damage was already done. And today, most Americans still don't know that while they were being told to tighten their belts, the Fed was wiring trillions to stabilize global finance behind the scenes. You stand at the corner of Wall Street, watching a bronze bull shine under camera flashes. Somewhere in a back office, another spreadsheet loads. Names are redacted. Columns stretch endlessly to the right. The bailout ended. The story? Not even close. You're opening a plain white envelope in the mid-1960s. There's no return address, just a single typewritten sheet inside. The message is short, cold, cruel. It says you're a fraud, a danger, an embarrassment. It suggests, no, urges, you to take your own life. You've received a suicide letter. And the worst part, it wasn't sent by an enemy. It was sent by your own government. The most infamous of these was sent to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., mailed by the FBI during the height of his activism. But he wasn't the only one. Under the FBI's COINTELPRO program, psychological warfare was just another tactic used against American citizens the Bureau deemed subversive. One mainstream fact. In 1975, the Church Committee revealed the existence of an anonymous letter the FBI sent to MLK, accusing him of moral failings and strongly implying he should kill himself before his disgrace was revealed. The letter ended with the line, "There is only one thing left for you to do." Your quirky tidbit? The letter was sent alongside a tape recording captured by FBI wiretaps, containing personal information meant to shame and psychologically destroy him. The agents even attempted to disguise it as a note from a disillusioned supporter, despite the obviously formal institutional tone. Scientists, psychologists, and historians still argue over the ethical abyss that allowed this to happen. Not only was the letter approved, but it was part of a broader strategy to destabilize civil rights leaders, feminist organizers, student activists, and even celebrities. Anyone with influence, and a message the government didn't like, was fair game. You leaf through a file labeled Personal Destruction Tactics. It's chilling. There's mention of false rumors, forged letters, pressure on landlords and employers to sever ties. The aim wasn't just surveillance, it was ruin. And while King's letter became the most iconic, other targets received similar treatment. There were artists and musicians blacklisted, professors discredited, political activists smeared with false claims of infidelity or communism, all pushed quietly by federal hands. Imagine receiving a threat that sounded oddly bureaucratic. No handwriting, just courier font and cold punctuation. And knowing it came not from a troll, not from a crank, but from an office at the J. Edgar Hoover building. Some of these letters were laughably transparent. Others were devastatingly effective. Relationships were ruined. Careers collapsed. Some recipients never knew they were targeted. They just thought their lives had randomly come apart at the seams. You sit in a room with peeling paint, holding the letter in your hands. The words are sharp. The message is unmistakable. The voice behind it isn't loud, but it's powerful. And it wears a badge. The FBI has since admitted to exceeding legal bounds during this era. But no formal apology has ever been issued to many of the people targeted. Most were never even told they had been watched, much less sabotaged. The lights hum softly overhead. The letter trembles in your hands. It's not just a message, it's evidence. of a moment when justice was weaponized and silence was sold as patriotism. You're staring at a glowing screen in the early 1980s, watching a bland TV news anchor calmly report the day's events. Nothing unusual, nothing controversial, but the language, a little too polished, a little too aligned. You flip the channel, another anchor, same tone, same phrasing. You start to wonder, who's really writing the script? This isn't media, it's message control. And the people behind it? The CIA. Welcome to the shadowy edges of Operation Mockingbird's second act, where government disinformation wasn't just a Cold War tactic overseas. It shaped what Americans read, heard, and believed for decades. While we already peeked behind the curtain in Section 13, this chapter goes deeper, because even after COINTELPRO and the Church Committee outed much of the CIA's media meddling, rumors and declassified hints suggest the influence never fully stopped. It just evolved. One mainstream fact. In 1977, journalist Carl Bernstein, yes, that Bernstein, published an expose in Rolling Stone revealing that over 400 American journalists had secretly worked with the CIA, either knowingly or as assets of convenience. Your quirky tidbit? Among the cooperating outlets were some of the most respected names in journalism: the New York Times, Time Magazine, CBS News. Some reporters were paid to plant stories. Others simply received tips, access, or guidance in exchange for subtle editorial nudges. Scientists and media analysts still argue how deeply the CIA continued to embed itself in journalism post-1970s. Officially, the agency claims it no longer recruits journalists. But when pressed on whether it still works with them, the answers get fuzzy. You pull up a memo marked Influence Operation, Domestic Perception. It outlines strategy for shaping public opinion during a foreign intervention. Step 1. Leak to friendly journalists. Step 2. Provide talking points. Step 3. Discredit dissenters by planting op-eds labeling them as naive or unpatriotic. It's information warfare, conducted with a smile and a byline. And here's the kicker. Sometimes, disinformation wasn't just about adding false stories. It was about removing true ones. Editors were reportedly pressured to spike stories that exposed covert operations, leaked policy documents, or revealed embarrassing military failures. You begin to notice the patterns. Certain narratives catch on too fast. Certain phrases appear in every outlet, almost as if they were copy-pasted. Grave threat to democracy. Necessary sacrifice. Sources close to the matter. Sound familiar? In the modern era, the tools have changed, but the principle remains. Today, influence flows through social media, think tanks, pundits, and even Hollywood. Hello again, Section 24. The medium shifted. The message still curated. You turn off the TV. You sit in silence. The noise fades. But in your mind, the question lingers. How much of what I've read, seen, and believed was planted? The answer isn't simple, but the possibility alone should keep you thinking. Because the truth, when shaped by too many hands, can turn into something else entirely. A story with all the facts, except the one that matters most. You're thumbing through a Department of Defense press kit from the early 2000s. Glossy pages, bright graphics, confident buzzwords, human terrain teams, cultural intelligence, non-kinetic operations. Sounds friendly enough. But hidden beneath the jargon is a deeply unsettling truth. The US military embedded anthropologists with combat units to manipulate foreign populations. And yes, it was real. This was the short-lived but very real era of the Human Terrain System, HTS, a counterinsurgency experiment where social scientists were deployed to war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan, not with notebooks and flip-flops, but with flak jackets and military escorts. The idea was bold. If we understand the culture, maybe we can win hearts and minds. But in practice, it blurred the line between research and warfare and turned scholars into strategic assets. One mainstream fact: at its peak in 2010, the US Army's Human Terrain System had over 400 personnel, including anthropologists, sociologists, and political scientists, operating in active conflict zones under military command. Your quirky tidbit? The HTS program had trouble recruiting real anthropologists. Many refused to participate, citing the American Anthropological Association's ethical code, which forbids covert research and any involvement in causing harm to studied populations. So some HTS experts ended up being cultural enthusiasts or underqualified contractors, with wildly mixed results. Scientists, military officials, and ethicists still argue whether the program was an act of cultural sensitivity or soft-core psychological manipulation. Proponents claimed it helped reduce violence by avoiding cultural missteps. Critics said it weaponized human understanding and turned villages into lab rats. You're embedded with a platoon moving through Kandahar. An HTS advisor pulls aside the commander and whispers about local burial customs. Don't step here. Don't eat that. Don't interrupt this ceremony. Suddenly, the mission adjusts. No shots fired. A win, they say. But elsewhere, things don't go as cleanly. Locals realize the friendly civilian with the notebook is on the military payroll. Trust evaporates. Interviews end. Villages go quiet. And resentment brews in silence. You flip through an internal review. It's less about ethics and more about funding. ROI not achieved. Difficult to quantify cultural impact. And just like that, by 2014, the program was quietly disbanded after burning through hundreds of millions of dollars. But the legacy? Still lingering. Some say the HTS helped pioneer a new kind of warfare. Informational, emotional, psychological. Others say it was a cautionary tale about mixing soft science with hard power. You close the binder. Somewhere, the same idea is probably being pitched again, with shinier branding, smart influence, empathic engagement. The tools change, the goals not so much. Because if knowledge is power, then turning cultural understanding into a tactical asset might just be the most dangerous idea of all. You're in a rural county office in North Carolina in the 1950s. The wallpaper's peeling. A ceiling fan hums lazily overhead. You're here to register to vote, but the man behind the desk isn't handing you a form. He's handing you a test. One that makes no sense. One you're destined to fail. Welcome to the world of racially targeted voter suppression. Not a conspiracy theory, but a confirmed policy that went on for decades. This isn't just about intimidation or misinformation. It's about systems designed from the ground up to prevent Black Americans and other minorities from casting a ballot. And while the surface has changed, the roots still run deep. One mainstream fact: literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses were all legal tools used for decades to disenfranchise voters, particularly Black citizens in the American South. Many of these weren't abolished until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and even then, enforcement was spotty. Your quirky tidbit: Some literacy tests included questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Or, recite the Constitution backward. Others demanded you name all 67 county judges in the state, from memory. Meanwhile, white voters were waved through with a nod. Scientists, historians, and legal experts still argue about whether modern voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and voter roll purges are new tools built on old blueprints. The parallels are too close for comfort, and sometimes they're not even subtle. You flip through an archived registrar log, page after page marked rejected, failed test. No notes, no appeals, just names, many of which appear again decades later in civil rights lawsuits. And it wasn't just tests. There were purges, where voter rolls were quietly cleaned of ineligible names, often targeting communities of color. Entire apartment buildings were flagged under the assumption that no one there votes. Some towns even moved polling places far outside of city centers, then reduced public transit on election days. You walk down a hallway lined with filing cabinets. One drawer contains a chilling memo. If challenged, refer to State Statute 274B. Translation: lie low, cite technicalities, and keep certain people from voting. Even in the 2000s and 2010s, lawsuits uncovered coordinated efforts to suppress turnout. In 2013, a key part of the Voting Rights Act was struck down by the Supreme Court, removing the requirement that certain states get federal approval before changing voting laws. Within 24 hours, several states rolled out new restrictions. And here's the kicker. Most of the architects behind these systems didn't wear robes or carry burning torches. They wore suits, sat on county boards, smiled in campaign ads. Because structural injustice doesn't always come with a dramatic soundtrack, it's more often buried in a line of legalese on page 37 of a state bill. You close the logbook. The dust tickles your nose. Somewhere, in a quiet office, a new form is being drafted. It won't say what it really means, but it will have the same effect. Because even when laws change, the goal sometimes doesn't. Keep the vote out of the wrong hands. You're flipping through pages of a glossy military brochure in the late 1990s. It's sleek, full of buzzwords like non-lethal weapons, crowd control, and active denial. One image shows a person fleeing from an invisible force gripping their head. The caption reads, "Long-range acoustic device in action." You blink. Wait, sound as a weapon? Yep. Welcome to the world of directed energy crowd control, where science fiction met reality, and then got quietly buried under policy reviews. The most headline-friendly of these devices is the LRAD, Long-Range Acoustic Device, originally developed for military use, now quietly deployed by police departments across the US. It emits an ear-piercing tone that can cause nausea, disorientation, and even temporary hearing loss. It's real, it's been used, and most people have never heard about it, until they literally do. One mainstream fact: LRADs were used during the 2009 G20 summit in Pittsburgh, and have since shown up at protests across the US, including during Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020. Your quirky tidbit: there's a lower setting labeled Voice Projection Mode, which supposedly lets authorities issue commands from up to half a mile away. In practice, protesters report it sounding like a megaphone from hell. Scientists and legal experts still argue whether these weapons violate constitutional rights. They don't maim or kill, but they do inflict pain. And that raises the eternal question: what does non-lethal really mean when the goal is compliance through suffering. You're standing in a test range now. A contractor flips a switch. A tone fills the air. It's not just loud, it's focused, like a laser made of sound. You instinctively step back. Your vision wobbles. You feel it in your bones. It's not the volume, it's the pressure. There's also the active denial system, sometimes called the pain ray. It fires a beam of millimeter wave radiation that heats the outer layer of your skin to 130 degrees in seconds. No burns, no marks. Just pain so sudden and unbearable that your only instinct is to run. It was tested, deployed on military bases, even truck-mounted for possible riot use. But public reaction was, let's say, tepid. The phrase, invisible heat ray, tends to cause concern, even among optimists. You find a Department of Defense memo with a checklist. Psychological effectiveness, injury potential, optical safety. There's no box for long-term trauma, though. Protesters who've faced LRADs often report ringing ears, migraines, and anxiety. Not exactly in the pamphlet. These tools are sometimes framed as more humane alternatives to tear gas, rubber bullets, or physical force. But that logic assumes pain is the only variable. What about fear? What about unseen force, deployed silently from a rooftop without warning? And here's the part that sticks. There's almost no federal regulation around these devices, no clear usage standards, no formal public debate. They were developed, tested, and deployed in the kind of quiet that only sound weapons could shatter. You step away from the demonstration. Your ears are still ringing. Somewhere, an agency labels this a success. But to you, it felt like a weapon disguised as science fiction. You're driving through a sunny stretch of Southern California in the 1950s. Billboards advertise brand new suburbs. Gas is 20 cents a gallon, and the future feels wide open. But up ahead, a sign warns, freeway construction, expect delays. And behind that delay, a very deliberate decision. Because this isn't just roadwork. This is urban renewal by demolition. And it was planned. Welcome to the true story of how America's highways were weaponized against minority communities. In cities from Los Angeles to Detroit, Chicago to New Orleans, planners chose where highways would go. And more often than not, they chose to carve them straight through the hearts of Black, Latino, and poor white neighborhoods. Not because it made logistical sense, but because it made social and economic sense to the people in charge. One mainstream fact, a 1980 report by the U.S. Department of Transportation acknowledged that many interstate routes were intentionally placed to demolish so-called blighted communities, a euphemism often applied to thriving, tightly knit minority neighborhoods. Your quirky tidbit? In the 1960s, the city of Miami built I-95 directly over Overtown, a vibrant black neighborhood known as the Harlem of the South. Roughly 20,000 residents were displaced. Many were given no relocation support, and the community never recovered. Scientists, urban historians, and city planners still argue whether this was social engineering or merely a cold calculus of cost and land value. But internal memos and local planning board records show the same language cropping up again and again. Remove undesirable elements, clear slums, renew city core. You look at a zoning map from 1955. It's color-coded. The red zone, predominantly black. That's also where the new highway's going. Coincidence? Hardly. It was often cheaper and politically easier to bulldoze those neighborhoods than it was to fight wealthy, well-connected suburbs. And the consequences were brutal. Families displaced, generational wealth erased, businesses shuttered, churches split. Some communities lost not just homes, but identity. In Syracuse, New York, the construction of I-81 tore apart the 15th Ward, a black community that had been growing for generations. You stand at a freeway overpass now. The rush of traffic below feels eternal. But beneath this concrete river lies a buried story, of front porches that used to sit where exit ramps now stand, of kids who once rode bikes down what's now a 6-lane arterial. And it wasn't just highways. Urban renewal projects in the mid-20th century operated under the doctrine of slum clearance, which often targeted the same communities. In practice, it was legalized displacement, sometimes called N-word removal, even by critics at the time. Today, cities are beginning to reckon with that history. Some are proposing to tear down these divisive roadways, or cap them with parks and housing. But the damage is long done. You fold up the old map. The roads don't just tell you where to go. They tell you who was allowed to stay and who was told to leave. And suddenly, traffic feels a lot heavier. You're flipping through a 1954 edition of Popular Mechanics when you stumble on a bizarre diagram, a flying saucer labeled U.S. Air Force Prototype. You chuckle. Clearly science fiction, right? Except it's not. That disc-shaped contraption was very real. It was part of Project 1794, one of the many Cold War-era efforts where the U.S. military seriously tried to build a flying saucer, not just for fun, but for warfare. Yes, America tried to make UFOs on purpose. The military didn't just investigate reports of unidentified flying objects. They tried to create them. The Avro car, a joint venture with Canadian aircraft manufacturer Avro, was designed to lift off vertically like a helicopter and zip around at supersonic speeds like a jet. It looked like a sci-fi movie prop. It was also completely real. One mainstream fact: in 2012, the US Air Force declassified documents confirming that Project 1794 was a funded program in the 1950s with the stated goal of creating a disc-shaped aircraft capable of flying at Mach 4 and altitudes over 100,000 feet. Your quirky tidbit: the prototype, called the Avro car, never quite worked as planned. During tests, it wobbled uncontrollably at just a few feet off the ground, earning it the nickname a flying manhole cover. Not exactly the future of air superiority. Scientists and aviation historians still argue whether the project was even technically feasible or just a costly Cold War fantasy. But one thing's clear: the US was deeply invested in unconventional flight, and this wasn't even the only flying saucer project on the books. You walk into a hangar filled with dust and quiet ambition. Engineers huddle around blueprints with wild-eyed optimism. They dream not of alien encounters, but of maneuverability without runways, aircraft that could deploy anywhere, reach impossible speeds, and evade radar like a whisper. And here's where things get strange. While Project 1794 fizzled, the concepts it tested lived on. Many of the propulsion theories and design ideas fed into other black projects, like stealth technology and VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing systems. So while the saucer shape didn't stick, the thinking behind it absolutely did. You find a declassified document stamped "Top Secret, now unclassified." It reads like science fiction. Plasma-based propulsion under review. Centrifugal lift modeling inconclusive. Recommend continued funding. These weren't alien crafts. These were government engineers pushing physics to its breaking point. Later, when civilians saw strange objects darting across the sky, it wasn't always little green men. Sometimes it was us, testing a next-gen airframe, far from prying eyes. Of course, the irony is delicious. For years, the government laughed off UFO sightings, even as it literally funded the creation of flying saucers. It's the kind of doublethink that makes conspiracy theories so irresistible. Because occasionally, they're half true. You step back from the hangar floor, the lights flicker. The Avro car prototype sits like a museum piece, still and silent. But the dream it represented, the idea of flight unbound by wings and logic, never really landed. It just changed shape. You're sitting in a classroom in the 1980s, staring at the fluorescent-lit chalkboard. The lesson? Drugs are evil. Crack is everywhere. Dealers lurk behind every bush. You're told it's a war, and you're a soldier. But what they don't mention is that the battlefield was rigged, and the enemy was placed there by design. This is the story of how the CIA's covert activities in Latin America helped fuel the American crack epidemic, a theory once dismissed as fringe, now holding chilling weight. In the late 1990s, journalist Gary Webb dropped a bombshell, a multi-part exposé titled Dark Alliance, which connected the CIA to Nicaraguan Contra rebels, cocaine smuggling, and the flood of crack into inner-city Los Angeles. The response? Denial, outrage, and eventually resignation. One mainstream fact. In 1998, under mounting pressure, the CIA declassified internal reports admitting that it had worked with Contra-linked groups known to be involved in drug trafficking, and that these relationships were not properly investigated nor disrupted by the agency. Your quirky tidbit? One trafficker, Freeway Ricky Ross, became a kingpin largely off cheap cocaine supplied by a Nicaraguan connection tied directly to US-backed rebels. Ross reportedly moved millions of dollars in product without knowing he was part of a geopolitical strategy. Scientists, sociologists, and intelligence experts still argue over whether the CIA directly facilitated the drug trade, or simply looked the other way in service of Cold War goals. The agency's line, we knew, but we didn't help. Critics call that moral gymnastics of the highest order. You walk through a south-central LA neighborhood in the 1980s. The streets are cracked, schools underfunded, jobs scarce. And suddenly, here comes crack, cheap, addictive, devastating. The timing is no coincidence. It filled a vacuum, and then it burned everything in it. Webb's reporting was dismissed at first. He was discredited. His career was ruined. And in 2004, he died from 2 gunshot wounds to the head, officially ruled a suicide, sparking a whole other tier of speculation. But years later, even mainstream outlets conceded that his central claim, that US intelligence had protected drug traffickers linked to the Contras, was accurate. You open a redacted memo from the CIA Inspector General. One paragraph sticks out. The agency did not adequately share information with DEA and other law enforcement bodies concerning suspected drug operations by Contra groups. Translation: they knew, and they stayed quiet. The damage wasn't limited to LA. Crack spread like wildfire through cities across America. Families were shattered. Incarceration skyrocketed. And who bore the brunt? Black and brown communities who were simultaneously vilified for addiction and crushed by draconian sentencing laws. Meanwhile, The government was funneling millions to the same rebel groups, indirectly bankrolling the crisis. Freedom fighters by day, traffickers by night, and the American people were stuck in the middle. You shut the folder. The headlines may have faded, but the fallout echoes. Mass incarceration, generational trauma, and an enduring mistrust of institutions that once promised to protect. You sit in that same classroom again. The chalk squeaks. The lesson is the same. But this time, you know better. Not every war is fought overseas. Some are quietly waged at home, with pipelines made of cocaine, politics, and denial. You're sitting in a beige conference room in Washington, D.C., sometime around 1975. The curtains are drawn. The mood is tense. On the table lies a single, stark document. Subject: Human Behavior Research, unclassified summary. You flip it open. It reads like dystopian fiction. Electroshock, hypnosis, secret drug trials. You're staring at the legacy of Project MKUltra, the CIA's now infamous mind control program. Once dismissed as paranoid fantasy, now confirmed history. This was no rogue experiment. It was a massive, decades-long initiative that involved hundreds of sub-projects, dozens of front organizations, and countless unwitting participants. Its mission: to explore the limits of human manipulation using chemicals, psychological torture, and behavioral conditioning. One mainstream fact: in 1907, following a Freedom of Information Act request, the US government released 20,000 declassified documents proving MKUltra's existence. Senate hearings followed, where even former CIA officials admitted to extreme and unethical experimentation. Your quirky tidbit? At one point, the CIA funded an all-night San Francisco brothel where sex workers unknowingly dosed clients with LSD, while agents observed behind two-way mirrors. It was dubbed Operation Midnight Climax, because of course it was. Scientists, ethicists, and legal scholars still argue about how deep MKUltra's rabbit hole goes. Most records were intentionally destroyed in 1973 under the orders of CIA Director Richard Helms. What we know today comes from the fragments that survived, meaning most of the truth is still in the shadows. You shuffle through a logbook of test subjects. Some were mental hospital patients. Others were college students lured by fake research grants. Some were soldiers. Many never gave informed consent, and many didn't even know they were being experimented on. The drug of choice? LSD, though MKUltra also dabbled in mescaline, barbiturates, amphetamines, and even sensory deprivation tanks. The goal wasn't healing. It was breaking people down to see how far their minds could bend before snapping. One scientist, Dr. Ewan Cameron, ran a notorious offshoot in Canada where patients were drugged, shocked, and forced to listen to recorded messages for weeks on end. The victims were told they were receiving treatment. Instead, many left with permanent brain damage, amnesia, or psychosis. You lean back in your chair, staring at a photo of a test room. It's cold, clinical. Wires hang like spider legs. A label on one machine reads, Dream Pattern Recording, Phase 3. The idea that this was funded, staffed, and protected by your own government, that's the stuff of nightmares. And yet, MKUltra wasn't about creating Manchurian candidates or magic brainwashing buttons. Not exactly. It was a sprawling, often chaotic search for control, over enemies, over information, over human nature itself. Eventually, the program was shuttered. Sort of. Elements of its research were quietly absorbed into other branches, rebranded under new acronyms. MK Ultra was dead in name, but in spirit, who's to say? You close the file. Your fingers feel sticky with old secrets. Outside, the world buzzes along, unaware that once, in the name of national security, people were treated like lab rats, their minds stretched, drugged, and dissolved in silence. The lesson? Sometimes the scariest conspiracies are the ones hiding in government archives. You're at a Veterans Affairs hospital in the 1970s. The waiting room smells like antiseptic and cigarette smoke. Men in uniform sit quietly, some missing limbs, others just staring. But you're not here for treatment. You're here for paperwork, signatures, disclosures, maybe a consent form you don't really understand. What you don't know is that you're about to be enrolled in a secret medical experiment. This is the story of radiation testing on US citizens, where soldiers, patients, and even children were intentionally exposed to radioactive materials without their full knowledge, all in the name of science and national security. One mainstream fact. In the 1990s, President Bill Clinton created the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, which confirmed that thousands of Americans were subjected to secret radiation studies during the Cold War, many of whom were never told the risks or even that they were participants. Your quirky tidbit. In one experiment, terminally ill patients at a Cincinnati hospital were bombarded with full-body radiation, sometimes multiple times a week, not as treatment, but purely to observe side effects. Doctors stood behind lead shields while the patients were unprotected. Scientists and ethicists still argue how much these experiments contributed to our understanding of radiation effects. Supporters claimed it helped design safer protocols for nuclear defense. Critics argue the same data could have been gathered ethically, if ethics had been considered at all. You sit in a sterile exam room. A technician preps an injection. He says it's just a tracer, something to help with imaging. What he doesn't say is that it contains plutonium, or iodine-131, or that your name is being logged for a classified case file. Many of the victims were especially vulnerable. Children with developmental disabilities, cancer patients, prisoners, and low-ranking soldiers. Some were told they were receiving vitamin supplements, when in fact, they were being dosed with radioactive isotopes. You flip through one case summary. Patient exhibited vomiting, hair loss, and liver damage. Recommend further trials. There's no mention of consent, no family notification, just cold observation. And it wasn't just in hospitals. Military personnel were ordered to march through nuclear test sites mere hours after detonation to assess the battlefield. Fallout drifted through the air like snow. Soldiers were told it was safe. Years later, many developed cancer, sterility, and severe autoimmune disorders. Then there's the Green Run incident, where the government released a cloud of radioactive iodine over eastern Washington state to study how it dispersed. Thousands of civilians were unknowingly exposed. The report was buried for decades. You hold a yellowed memo stamped "Confidential, for internal use only." It outlines how to brief participants without alarming them. Avoid direct reference to radiation. Emphasize national importance. And here's the painful truth. No one was held accountable. Some programs were quietly halted. Others were rebranded. The victims were often never informed, compensated, or even acknowledged until decades later, if at all. You step out of the hospital. The sun feels warm on your skin. Somewhere inside, another dose is being prepped. Another experiment is being logged, all in the pursuit of knowledge, all under the radar. Because when fear drives science and secrecy shields consequences, the human body becomes just another variable. You're standing at the edge of a dusty runway in Nevada. It's just past midnight, and the desert air is still. You can see the faint outline of fences, motion sensors, and strange buildings that aren't on any map. Behind you, an unmarked bus idles, its windows blacked out, and in the distance, a shape rises, sharp, angular, nothing like a commercial plane. Welcome to Area 51, where conspiracy, innovation, and denial have danced together for decades. For years, the US government insisted Area 51 didn't exist. Maps showed blank spaces. Officials refused to comment, which of course only made people more curious. But beneath the legends of little green men and crash saucers lies something more grounded and maybe more unsettling. America's most secret military aviation testing site. One mainstream fact. In 2013, the CIA officially acknowledged the existence of Area 51 for the first time, confirming that it had been used for decades to test classified aircraft like the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird. Your quirky tidbit. Pilots testing these planes in the 1960s flew so high that commercial pilots, seeing unfamiliar shapes at impossible altitudes, began flooding the FAA with UFO reports. Rather than explain, the government let the alien theory run wild because it was easier than admitting they were spying on the Soviets from the edge of space. Scientists, aviation historians, and curious civilians still argue whether Area 51 houses only experimental aircraft or if there's something weirder inside. Former employees have hinted at reverse engineering foreign tech, including aircraft not of this earth, though no hard proof has ever surfaced. You flip through a 1990s memo from a declassified report. Subject: Groom Lake Facility, Operational Secrecy. It outlines elaborate protocols for moving classified parts under cover of darkness, scrambling flight paths, and yes, staging disinformation campaigns. Disinformation wasn't just tolerated, it was weaponized. A perfect example? The Aurora Project, an alleged hypersonic aircraft the military has never admitted exists. Yet multiple witnesses, including defense contractors, reported hearing skyquakes and seeing strange contrails in the early 1990s. Some believe it flew out of Area 51. Others say it never existed. But the ambiguity? That's the point. You walk through a hangar, imagining what's under the tarps. Could it be new stealth drones, supersonic gliders, maybe just prototypes that were scrapped? The truth is, for every one project revealed, 10 more remain sealed behind layers of secrecy, buried under NDAs and redacted pages. And the culture surrounding Area 51 hasn't helped. From the Storm Area 51 meme to late-night talk shows, it's become a punchline. But the reality is more interesting than jokes. This place is where national defense pushes the edge of what's possible, and where, historically, transparency goes to die. You stand again in the desert. Somewhere behind you, sensors have already detected your presence. Somewhere up above, a camera is watching. And somewhere below the sand, decades of secrets hum quietly beneath radar domes. Whatever you believe, aliens or not, the simple fact is this: Area 51 was real all along. And the truth, as always, was stranger than fiction, because it was both. You're leafing through a binder marked Special Access Required, in a secure Pentagon office. Inside are colorful slides, bullet points, and phrases like cyber psyops, perception shaping, and digital dominance. It looks like something out of a marketing pitch, except the product being sold here isn't tech, it's belief. And the buyers? Everyone online. Welcome to the real digital battlefield, where governments and defense contractors wage quiet wars on public perception through online influence operations. Once dismissed as a paranoid fantasy, this final tale is about fake accounts, planted narratives, and meme warfare, where agencies and private firms manipulate the internet the way DJs scratch vinyl. It doesn't take soldiers or bullets, just bots and hashtags. One mainstream fact. In 2022, Facebook's parent company, Meta, confirmed it had removed several pro-US fake account networks run across multiple platforms. These were linked to Pentagon-affiliated groups pushing narratives in the Middle East and Central Asia under false identities. Your quirky tidbit? One campaign used a fake Persian-language media outlet, complete with fabricated bylines and AI-generated profile pictures, to promote pro-US talking points, like criticizing the Taliban or boosting local views of American aid efforts. And it worked, until someone noticed the faces didn't blink quite right. Scientists, journalists, and cybersecurity experts still argue where the ethical line is in online influence. If it's done for democracy, is it still propaganda? What if it's true information, but spread deceptively? What happens when every side is doing it? You scroll through a fake Twitter thread from 2020. It looks legit. A viral post about vaccines, a string of concerned replies. All fake, all planted. You click on the user, a profile photo scraped from LinkedIn, bio pulled from a university website. The account tweets 24 hours a day. Because it's not a person, it's a persona. You look deeper. The US has quietly funded tools like Inspiration, a DARPA-backed AI system designed to detect and counter online disinformation. Sounds great, until you realize that some of the same tools can be flipped to spread it, if the mission demands it. Meanwhile, private contractors get in on the action. Firms like Graphica, Signal Labs, and others analyze, shape, and often seed narratives for clients that range from governments to Fortune 500 companies. Influence in the digital world is just another commodity. The goal isn't to lie outright. It's to nudge, amplify, distract. One retired information officer described it as flooding the zone with plausible noise. Not false, not true, just louder. And it's not only foreign targets. In 2021, a whistleblower revealed that US Special Operations Command ran covert social media accounts targeting domestic audiences, despite laws that prohibit such operations. The report vanished from the headlines in a week. You shut the binder, you open your phone. Suddenly, every post feels a little suspect. Who's behind that comment? Who's trending that hashtag? Who benefits? This isn't the future. It's now. The battlefield is your feed. The weapons are your clicks. And the enemy. Sometimes it's not even human. Because in this world of perfectly tailored posts and algorithmic illusions, the final confirmed conspiracy is this. You were never meant to know who's telling the story. And now, as our strange and shadowy journey comes to a close, let's take one last breath together. Soften your thoughts now. Let your mind drift like dust through quiet corridors. The secrets are no longer sharp. They're soft around the edges, fading into dreams. Names blur, timelines slow. Even the strangest truths lose their weight in the stillness. You are safe. You are grounded. Let go of the questions, the whispers, the what-ifs. Sleep isn't an escape. It's a return. And tonight, you return with just a little more knowledge, and just enough mystery to keep your dreams interesting.